first of all, before you begin, it's such an honor to be here at the Literary Festival, but maybe even more of an honor to be here next to William Dalrymple, one of the great writers of our time. I did this book recently on India, and I think the best part of the book actually is Willie's introduction to my pictures. So I've been following your career for a long time. So it's an honor to be here. It's really, the people you've brought in this year, Don McCullen and whatnot, and one of my great heroes. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Steve. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid a bit of a... Thank you. A bit of a cock-up this morning. This is meant to be Basharat's session, but he's got lost, and the pen drive with him. So we're going to have a session on photography without any illustration at all. But you can all go and buy Steve's wonderful new book at the bookshop, which will contain all the images and all the adventures that we're talking about. It is the most magnificent book ever published visually on India, ever. And,
but I was under the impression that everybody got a free book.
The Steve McCurry Foundation has generally waived all rights and is donating one to on behalf of the festival. So, Steve, so let's start at the beginning. Born and brought up in the States, but ended up in Sweden.
Yeah, well, it even goes back further than that. My family, we used to subscribe to Life magazine, which no longer exists, but it was a great picture magazine. And when I was 12 years old, there was this big photo spread by a New Zealand photographer named Brian Brake on the monsoon. Yeah, Brian was a great photographer. He traveled throughout India, Kashmir, all over the place. So I saw this essay with these incredible pictures of this weather phenomenon, this rain, people running around, and I thought, oh my, I want to see that. I want to go to that place.
How old were you?
I was 12.
And at this point, where were you? Where in the
I was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, growing up, and but those images sort of stuck with me, and and so if you kind of fast forward to later on when I traveled, my whole ambition in life was to travel and see the world. So when I was 19 out of high school, I went to live in Sweden, just arbitrarily. I was looking for a place to, and just by chance, the boy, the young boy in the family, the 15-year-old boy, was an amateur photographer. We used to go out on the weekend and sort of just click pictures just for the fun of wandering and observing. And that was a pivotal point for me because suddenly photography wasn't just about, a birthday or a monument. It was just wandering around photographing ordinary things, a dog or a crack in the sidewalk or whatever caught your imagination. So after Sweden, I went back to college and thinking, what can I do with my life? Well, maybe I want to be a filmmaker. So I started studying that, but that was actually a little bit too difficult. It turned out there was a lot more work than I thought it was. But in the course of that study, I took some still photography courses. And then I thought to myself, this is fun. Walk around, click here, click there, everything's spontaneous. Everything's sort of these serendipitous moments, and I said, forget the filmmaking. That's never going to happen. So I left school. The only job I could get at that time was working on a very small suburban newspaper, and but that was.
And where was this?
This was outside of Philadelphia, right. But these small papers, the assignments are, really boring pictures. And I did that for 3 years, and I was about ready to jump off the roof because I was so bored. And that's when I decided it was now or never. I had to, if I wanted to travel, I had to take some drastic steps. So I bought a one-way ticket to India. I thought,
So India was right at the beginning? Yeah.
Right at the beginning. I had done a little traveling in school, but I went to Africa for a few months and South America for.
So paint a picture. What date are we talking? What's going on in India? Is this Indira Gandhi? This is.
No, it was in between, I think. Or was it? When was it? It was
1970.
78.
So that is.
Moraji Desai.
Right.
Moraji Desai.
So the emergencies come and go.
I believe it was Moraji. I'm pretty sure. So I'm there and wandering around, and I didn't really know much about India. I got off the plane. There's a wonderful photographer named Avinash Pashrisha who
who's still around very much.
Yeah, we were together just the other day, and he was so kind and so hospitable. He kind of took me under his wing, and I went there for countless lunches and dinners, and he advised me. He was my kind of consigliere.
And how old are you at this point?
27.
Right.
So I got off the plane. I went up to, this was in February, and I got off the plane and went up to Dehradun on the train. It was like and I was so cold. I thought, India's going to be
I started off in Dehradun. my first week in India, I was teaching in St. Joseph's Academy in Dehradun. Yeah. That was 1984 was my beginning. Yeah.
So I went up to Missouri, and again, it was snowing. I thought, whoa, there were monkeys running around in the snow. It was quite a different sort of introduction. And the trip that initial trip was only going to be for like 6 weeks. But I went here, I went there, went down to Cody Canal in the south. I went to Goa, Bombay. And the 6 weeks ended up taking another 6 months, and then a year, and then it turned into 2 years. And I still felt like I hadn't really...
At this point, are you selling photographs to newspapers, sending them to magazines? What's happening?
Well, actually, I sent the pictures back to my sister. But sometimes I would take them to the post office. These rolls of film I would actually take to the post office and send them back home. They would develop them and try and sell them to magazines. But it was tough. I mean, it's tough now to make it go at photography, but it was
the most difficult thing.
It was impossible. I thought this is never going to happen. But my big break was when one June of '79, I kind of wandered into Afghanistan, and that really changed the course because nobody was interested in Afghanistan in sort of the spring of 1970.
This is the very last moment before the Russians.
Yeah. Well, it was about 6 months.
6 months before.
And but when they invaded in December of 1979, suddenly all the newspapers and magazines in the world were desperate for pictures of Afghanistan. So suddenly I'm going from this kind of wandering kind of freelance photographer to getting pictures on the page 1 and page 3 of the New York Times and Time Magazine, Stern in Germany, Paris Match in France, and suddenly I went from kind of 0 to 60. And then I went back almost 2 years to the date, and National Geographic had seen my work.
And this was your first liaison with this great institution, which has kept you under its wing.
Right. So I went down there, and they said maybe we have some work for you. They said there's this place in Pakistan called Baluchistan, which do you have any contacts in Baluchistan? Would you be, And of course I said, of course I have contacts. Didn't even know where Baluchistan was. And So they gave me the assignment, but when I got to Baluchistan, I realized they said, you can't, this whole province is restricted. They don't allow foreigners. So I thought, oh my God.
At this point, people like now respectable figures like Ahmed Rashid are fighting guerrilla wars against the Pakistani army.
Right, exactly, yeah. So I'm in Baluchistan. I thought it would be interesting to go into Afghanistan to show some of the Baluchi tribesmen living in Afghanistan.
And at this point, I remember my first visit to Quetta in '86, and at this point, Afghan refugees were still pouring across the border, and there were many camps around Quetta, and I remember one particular morning coming into Baluchistan from Iran, and we had this sort of magical vision of an Afghan caravan, which is sort of thing I'd only seen in your photographs, or the Micho's photographs, coming through the desert with this woman in sort of cloth of gold burqa. And this was the kind of images you were seeing?
Well, yeah, exactly. It was a very kind of romantic landscape with all this incredible things happening. So I'm in Baluchistan. I'm trying to photograph the Baluchis in Afghanistan, and I got arrested. I got put in jail in this...
Our old friends, the ISI, at you already. Yeah.
And they put me in jail. There was no food. They took my passport. And I thought, now I'm going to be expelled, and I failed. I won't be able to do the assignment. And I was there for like 5 days in this Pakistani prison. And
in the middle of nowhere, or in Quetta itself?
Well, it was a couple hours from Quetta in a very small town called Nushki, which is really obscure. And this is before, I'm sure they didn't have a telex machine. I don't even know if they had a telegram office there. So it took them 5 days to figure out, who the hell I was, because for all they knew, they thought I was running guns, or I was a spy, or I was,
or a Russian,
or a Russian. Yeah. And so after 5 days, they literally just opened the door. But right at the end, they put these manacles on my legs, and I thought that's kind of extreme.
You must be one of the last living people to have been manacled. Steve, so this is now Zia's Pakistan. America is beginning now to cozy up to Zia. Saudi Arabia and the CIA are setting up in Peshawar, beginning to arm the Mujahideen. And Peshawar suddenly turning into a sort of Berlin with different intelligence agencies looking at each other, the young bin Laden perhaps just beginning to arrive. Because Peshawar was the place that you made your entry into Afghanistan, famously, wasn't it?
Well, the game was, at that time, for journalists and photographers, was to show up in Peshawar, make contact with one of these political groups, and then they would sneak us into Afghanistan. The problem was that although we didn't really have permission, and the border guards, the police, the security wasn't informed that they should let us go. So we were I was again arrested, put in jail overnight. Many times I was caught on a bus and sent back to Peshawar. So, it was very difficult to get in to cover the story.
Were you worried by the physical challenges? Because, many people, I never did that stuff going in with the Mujj. I stayed cozily in Peshawar. But people that did describe these 50-mile forced marches and things. Were you worried just about being physically up to marching with the Mujj?
Yeah, they would get up. We had to walk everywhere. There were no motorcycles or buses or cars or taxis. So they're going up and down these mountains. They get up and pray before sunrise. They may or may not have a cup of tea, and it's still dark. We're going up the mountains, and I thought they're going to kill me.
Were you very, very physically fit at that stage? Or
I was reasonably physically fit, but not like that. And I got these big blisters on the bottom of my feet, and I had all this equipment in my clothes, and sometimes it would help carry my stuff, and sometimes they would get, we'd be in a big group, And I remember them looking for me to give me my stuff back, and I would kind of hide to keep from having it. Because we would walk literally all night long. We would start walking after sunset sometimes, and there were many times walk in order to avoid the helicopters.
So the Russian helicopter gunships are looking for you.
Yeah.
They're searching the valleys.
Right.
And did you ever get shot at? I mean, you must have been. Shot at by...
Oh, all the time. All the time. All the time. And, they sometimes, you think you're with a band of, really smart rebels or these moods that they knew they were really skilled. We'd get lost. Suddenly we realized, oh no, this is the wrong valley. We've climbed the wrong mountain. Let's go back and start over again. Literally. And I remember we were trying to go between. There's a valley which had been the Afghan army was surrounded it with tanks. Every few hundred meters there was a tank, and we tried to slip in between these tanks in the middle of the night. And I remember one.
How far apart were they?
A couple hundred meters.
Oh.
And they were firing flares off, so they would illuminate. And I remember this one soldier dropped his rifle, and in the middle of the night it made this incredible. And I thought, oh my God, they're gonna. And it's completely clean. There was not a rock or a tree. And I thought they're gonna flares it. They're gonna see it. They're gonna shoot us because these soldiers were so. Freaked out themselves. They would just fire into the night, just whatever, So anyway, it was a dangerous time, and we would. I don't speak Pashto, and often I was with these fighters, and I didn't know where we were going, and it's this life and death decision. Do I go with this group or that group, or they want to take me into this battle, and then if you decide you don't want to go, well, then what do? You're on your own, and it's like it was really very stressful, to say the least.
And how long were these tours? You were in for 2-3 weeks, or
2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
You go in, so you have to run the gauntlet of getting into Afghanistan,
avoiding the Pakistanis.
Right, and then you get in, and then you're trying to figure out who do I trust. What are they? What are they? They're going on an operation. Well, what does that mean? Come with us. We're going to go fight. And
were you with one particular group? I mean, many people went in with Masood, for example.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I would change groups inside. I would be with Masood's group, and then I'd go with another group, Galani or Rabbani or whatever. And but then after you were finished your work, then you'd have to get back into Pakistan and then run the risk of them confiscating your film. So the whole thing was complicated.
I have many friends who were in Peshawar at that time, and this is the period when you begin to get a cleavage between what the Americans want, which is basically trying to support the more secular end of things like Masood, and then what the ISI and the Saudis want, which was Hekmatyar. And I remember there's a particular moment, I can't remember which year, 1981 or something, when the head of French intelligence, who was posing as a journalist in Peshawar, was shot. He had an assassin's bullet at the back of his skull. And that was the moment when suddenly you started to get severe rivalries between the different groups, which added to the dangers for journalists going in because they could get caught. And Hekmatyar began to develop. It was the first time that you had someone on the fundamentalist end of the spectrum regarding the West as the enemy rather than the supplier of arms and the source of the money to fight the Russians. Did you get caught up between all that? Did you ever come across?
Well, this guy, Hekmatyar, was a really...
nasty piece of work.
Nasty. He actually had one of my translators, assassinator, killed, who had worked for the BBC. So I stayed very far from this Hizb Islami and that group. I stayed with the more moderate groups, and no, they were a bad lot. So I didn't get into that.
And this is now the 80s. We had yesterday Don McCullin talking about, in a sense, an earlier generation of war photography. He was in Cyprus, Lebanon, the big conflicts of the 70s, Biafra, and then most of all Vietnam. And Don was saying yesterday, he had this real death wish. He was in there in My Lai and the Tien Tsin offensive and some of the really big battles, and would be in there, watching. The regiment he went into had 50% casualties. Were you ever in that? I mean, in a sense, I associate Don more with the actual fighting of war and pictures of shell-shocked soldiers, while I've got more images of sort of destroyed houses, mujahideen praying. In a sense, you have two very different flavors, you two. Both.
Well, yeah, I was never.
You're less obsessed with war and more into Afghanistan, is there?
Yeah, I never considered myself a war photographer. Because men shooting at each other and all that. That was never really what that was not my ambition. I was more interested in the civilians, the people who were caught in the middle between these two factions. So no, the whole combat thing,
it was an obstacle for you taking the pictures rather than the object you were trying to shoot.
I never thought it was a good idea to be killed for taking a picture. It was just so. And again, the story for me was really the families and the children out playing and getting blown up by a rocket or a landmine. There was so many thousands of people who stepped on landmines. So for me, that was the real human story, rather than men playing, at shooting each other.
Do you think, though, that your images made a difference in America? Were people seeing your images? Did you feel a palpable reaction to them?
Well, I think I'm not sure. I know that, when I was working on that newspaper in Philadelphia, I used to go to the library and look at Don McCullin's books. And I thought, this is amazing.
I remember seeing at age 15 at my school.
Yeah.
We had this crappy library, but they had, for some reason, Hearts of Darkness.
Yeah.
And these extraordinary war images of,
No, it was really, no. So I was, but for me again, the whole, all my work, I think, in Afghanistan or I went to Lebanon. I was in the Gulf. It was always more of a human or an environmental approach to.
And you were working for National Geographic rather than the New York Times, presumably.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, but when you think about pictures that change public opinion, I remember the work of the picture of Nick Oot, who photographed that girl who had been napalmed in Vietnam, and she's running down the highway naked, fully naked, her clothes burned off her body. And her back burnt off. Yeah. And the New York Times, to their credit, ran that picture, I think, on page 1. Here's a child, frontal nudity, but yet the power of that picture, it just blew people away, and people started to think, well, maybe Vietnam isn't such a good idea after all. But for my work, I think that pictures can change people's perception in a small way, and maybe there's an accumulative effect. The more pictures they see of Afghan refugees, the more they come to the realization that somebody needs some help.
So tell us about the Afghan girl.
Yeah. Well, that was a picture which I think inspired a lot of people to go work in the refugee camps. So that was positive. It didn't, until we found her again 17 years later, that picture had no, this was nothing that she was aware of or knew anything about her. And so, but I think that her look, her dignity, the fact that you can, she's an orphan, she's a refugee,
and you can see the trauma.
And you can, but yet she still has this will, this human spirit to move on, and a very direct gaze, and not a particularly unhappy look. I think that I know Afghans have always been very proud of that picture. I several times I've met an Afghan taxi driver in either New York or Washington. And once we start talking about Afghanistan, and I tell them about the picture, they at the end of the ride, they said, "No, you don't have to pay. We don't want any money." And for especially an Afghan taxi driver, that's quite a rare thing.
For the geeky photographer enthusiast in the audience, could you talk technically? What film you're using Kodachrome always, and what kind of cameras?
Well, I used Kodachrome for 25 years.
You were the poster boy for Kodachrome.
Yeah, it was the best film ever made. And just a technical note about the picture, it was one of these rare, maybe even once in a lifetime situations where all the elements that make up a good picture, the light, the background, the expression, the emotional component, everything lined up perfectly. And I didn't really have to do a thing. The only thing I had to do was to make sure the picture was in focus and the settings were correct. But the whole success of the picture just had to do with her look and the light. The light played a major role in that picture because it was 11 o'clock in the morning, bright, sunny, but it was filtering into this tent, and it created this really wonderful sort of light on her face, and the background was perfect.
Light seems to be something which is a constant throughout. You're very aware of light and the play of light.
Right. No, light in photography is everything. I mean, of course, for me, the primary element in a picture should be the story. You want some emotional component. You want a picture should sort of take you somewhere, should change you or delight you or inspire you or make you laugh or make you cry. To me that's and I think that the Afghan girl takes us on a particular journey, and you try and imagine like what's her life like and where is she from, and all those sorts of things.
Just go back again, in a sense, to the process. So what's at this stage in your career? You're now working for National Geographic. You're beginning to become famous internationally. What's your working method? What cameras are you using? Do you have a darkroom in Peshawar? I mean, what's your process? Do you go back to New York to do all the work or selection? Or?
Well, no, back then, I sent everything back to National Geographic, and I wouldn't see the pictures for 2 months.
And they would select. It wasn't you doing the editing.
Well, when I came back, I would. But when I did the Baluchistan story, I didn't see the pictures for 6 months. So you're shooting, every day you're shooting, and you don't see anything. You don't even see, you get somebody in the magazine sending you a telex or a telegram saying, oh, there are a couple good pictures here and a couple good pictures there, but you're completely clueless. That's why digital photography today is so great, because we can see everything instantly, and we know if the light's right or if the composition is what we want or if the camera's working. I mean, sometimes if the lens gets...
Or you've got one little bit of dust in your
on the
camera,
sensor.
and you have a hole straight through the film. And,
So now you can... I mean, I knew photographers when we were shooting film that the lens was stuck at 1.8, and they're out on a sunny day shooting away. This is wonderful. And it turns out all the pictures are useless or ruined. So that you don't have that.
But you
problem.
were a famously late convert to digital.
Well, I started in about 2004, and I wasn't really. I had hoped that I could finish out my career with film, and I thought, this is but it came on so fast that it was clear that and you don't want to be sort of left behind. And also, National Geographic, the whole tide had turned, and they weren't demanding that we shoot digital, but the writing was on the wall that you got to get on the train before it leaves the station.
And so, did you sort of, belatedly have lessons in Photoshop and this kind of stuff, or?
Well, I always had an assistant travel with me. I mean, they always had. I hired some really smart Afghan assistants who knew about this a lot more than I did, and I always had somebody with me. I take somebody from home who could kind of download. In the beginning, this was way over my head. I didn't have a clue about the whole, backing things up in hard drives. We put everything on CDs back then, and it was a nightmare.
So from the Afghan war winds down, and like many people, in a sense, you lose a war and you lose a job. Did you find it easy to move on from Afghanistan?
Well, at that point, I really wanted to do different things. I wanted to go different places. I wanted to see other parts of the world. I went to Yugoslavia. I went to Germany. Then I photographed the Gulf War. So I wanted to branch out, and life is short, and you want to try different things. Even now, I want to dabble in different parts. I want to go to Cuba. I want to go to Madagascar. I want to go to Iran.
But it remains, nonetheless, the patch of land, I think, between Afghanistan and Southeast Asia that people associate you with.
Yeah, I would say that my photographic beat has been, I would say most of my career, in fact, has been between Afghanistan over to, say, Burma, and then Tibet to the north and Sri Lanka to the south. That's where I really...
So when did Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia kick in? When were you beginning to work in those areas? There's wonderful pictures of... there's fantastic Cambodian pictures. Extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, so I made several trips to Afghanistan. I started working for National Geographic in Balochistan. And that's when I suggested that we do a story in the monsoon. But I also, in my early days in India, had been given a copy of Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar.
He was here last year.
Yeah. And so I read that and I thought, why not do a photo essay on a train journey across India, across the subcontinent? So I proposed that. In fact, I did those two stories, I think the same year. And in fact, the Afghan girl was also at the tail end of 1984. So those three stories I did almost kind of simultaneously, and it actually,
the Afghan girl, the Indian trains, and the third?
The monsoon.
Monsoon.
All done, I would say, almost in the same year. So in a way, my best work in my life is,
Your annus mirabilis.
Yeah. So, what have I done since?
What date is that?
84.
84.
And the magazines were published in 85.
And you then did a book on Monsoon. Monsoon became a self-standing volume.
Yeah, and I did a book with Paul Theroux on the train trip. And
with that great picture of the steam train passing the Taj, which has now been used on the front of every tourist magazine a million times. Yeah.
I don't know. I think I may be wrong, but I think that was the first time a photographer had juxtaposed a steam locomotive with the Taj Mahal, because there was one sort of a shunting track which they would use to change locomotives, and that's when I realized that these two things would line up. So that was, and then I went back a few years ago. That track is gone. The trees in the picture are grown. There's homes, and you would never think that there had been a track in that particular place.
What's odd about being the sort of photographer you are is, in a sense, there's two different games at play. There's the magazines, who are paying for the trips and who are your primary employers, but you've also got an art gallery thing going at the same time. When did you start having exhibitions of all this material? I've seen exhibitions of your stuff. I was wandering around Paris last year, and there were two different Steve McCurry exhibitions going on. Yeah.
Well, we try and make our way in the world the best way we can, whether it's exhibitions or print sales, And I realized early on, 15 years ago, that the magazine market and making a living as a photographer doing magazine work, those days were kind of coming to a close. Not that I still work for magazines, but not the way I had. So, and I had
because there's less money around, or they're paying you less, or what?
the assignments. I used to work on an assignment for National Geographic 6 months, 8 months on one story, and
they'd put you up in hotels.
Oh,
they'd fly you around, and
everything was first class. No, seriously, all the flights were first class.
I hope you've got a decent hotel with the Constable given you.
We we go to Paris or London. We'd stay at the very best hotels, order the best wine. No, we didn't order any wine.
And that began to wind down as profits began to decline
Right.
with the rise of the
Well,
internet.
the circulation of National Geographic had gone from like 11 million, and it probably went half of that. So those days of 6-month assignments became 8 weeks or 6 weeks, and we were not flying first class. We weren't even flying business class. We were flying way back in the back of the plane in the middle seat, and we were staying in not the best hotels, but like a 2-star hotel.
So what came in to fill that gap for you was exhibitions.
Yes, so I started, I wanted to make books. I had this enormous archive with maybe 1 million pictures.
I've been to your New York archive with it.
Yeah.
Steve has got a flat on the one floor where he actually lives, and then below it an entire flat that's just negatives. And
Right. So I thought, okay, I have to start publishing this work. So I did books, and then from the books, exhibitions, and then print sales, which is now a significant part of my sort of life.
And what's your selection process? I mean, you've got obviously tens of millions of images. How do you pare them down and select them? Do you put them on a wall and see which last longer, so take them down, or what's the...
Yeah, well, I literally go through my work from 20 or 30 years ago several times a week. I'm there looking through pictures and scanning pictures, digitizing pictures. So that's a constant process. And, it's when you're looking at, you're in a village or in a place, the best picture really eventually kind of jumps out at you. And when there's more than, maybe there's several pictures, I just scan them all. And what I'll do is at the end, I'll print the pictures. I'll make a big stack of prints, and I'll start showing them to friends and family.
And see how people react to them.
And see which pictures people connect with. And eventually there's a kind of a, winnowing out process, and you come up with what you think is the picture which not only I like, but pictures which other people like too.
And have you had in your career great mentors at National Geographic or publishers who've been a major influence in the selection of your work and the direction of your work?
There was, for me, the big influence, I think, of my photography, my career has been Henri Cartier-Bresson, who was a fellow Magnum photographer. He was the great...
just in case anyone doesn't know about Magnum, maybe just give a little...
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Magnum Photo Agency was started by Henri Cartier-Bresson, a French photographer who...
The great
photographs in the 30s and the 40s. He was the last... he photographed Gandhi the afternoon that he was assassinated, and...
using tiny little Leicas.
Yeah. He has a great story about his encounter with Gandhi. And then the next, that night, he photographed Nehru announcing to the world that, Mahatma Gandhi had died. And he photographed partition. He photographed events in China. So, but he did it, so he was traveling the world photographing, but he did it in such an elegant, beautiful...
His was the famous image of Nehru flirting with Edwina Mountbatten.
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
Dickey looking on rather...
Yeah. So he was, and he had a great sense of design and composition. So he started this agency, which was really developed to protect photographers' their copyright, and so we kind of banded together, and we felt that there was more strength in photographers having this cooperative. And Robert Capa was one of the founders. So anyway, I would go to...
Capa, who finally landed on a landmine
in Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Yeah, it was killed. But I would take
and took the famous images of the Spanish Civil War.
Spanish Civil War. He
Yeah.
was one of the first photographers on Normandy Beach, and he was Kappa was
Sword
Hungarian.
Beach. Was he?
Hungarian, and he changed his name to Robert Kappa because it was an easier name to remember.
And Magnum has had most of the great photographers of the 20th century and 21st century. It's a limited group, isn't it?
There's a very limited, it's kind of a fraternity of these like-minded. Don McCullen had a loose affiliation. I know that everybody wanted Don to be in Magnum. I think we did some distribution of his pictures, but Sebastião Salgado was in Magnum for many years.
And from here, Raghu Rai.
Raghu Rai, a dear friend, one of the world's... He's not only a great Indian photographer, maybe the best Indian photographer who ever lived, but he's also one of the great photographers in the world. So, and a great spirit. And I've never seen Raghu flustered. You know, I've never seen Raghu get angry.
I've seen his wife, Gurmeet, get flustered.
But an incredible human being and a wonderful photographer.
So, how many are you in this sort of this pantheon of photographic gods?
When I were about 50, and
you have to be voted in by the other members, is
that
right?
Which is a very political thing. And there's one camp of photographers who are sort of documentary photographers, and there's another camp that are art photographers, and there's this constant conflict about, we should be photographing the world and current events, and the other group doing these sort of personal, projects. So I see they're both valid, but my past is clearly in that kind of, I would say, documentary.
You kind of bridge the two groups, don't you?
Yeah, I think that, Henri was a kind of a magazine photographer in one sense, but he also, now his pictures are considered kind of great art.
Who are your gods today? Who do you look to as the great lights of photography now?
Well, I think
Salgado?
I think the greatest living photographer for me is Elliot Erwitt. He was born in Italy and then moved to France and then moved to Hollywood, and so he's a wonderful photographer, a dear friend. I think Salgado is an incredible talent.
Genius.
And Jim Knockway, an old friend of mine who has kind of
also on the Afghan beat.
Yeah, and kind of following the footsteps of Don McCullen as a kind of I wouldn't say a war photographer. I think he's more of like an anti-war photographer. So these are some of the people who I think are some of the great voices in photography today.
We're running out of time. Just before we open it up to questions, your new book, India. This is a summation of the entire width and length and breadth of your career. What's the first photograph in there?
I think it's three men sitting on a step in Jodhpur. This is, you have this beautiful blue parts of the city, very interesting architecture, and then you have these three local. I think they were doing some work on the edge of the town, and they have these red turbans on, and it's just graphically, it's more of it's part graphic. The interest for me is the color and of course the graphic design. But interestingly enough, that was one of the pictures that Henri really kind of connected with. So this has always been one of my favorite pictures.
And just to close, just to say a little bit about what India has meant for you as a photographer.
Well, just to go back to the book is really more of I would say kind of a poem about places and people that kind of touched me, or memorable moments. So it's not really it's more a book about my personal journey and places and people that I think visually and emotionally I kind of connected with. It's not really an encyclopedic look at India. It's just my personal selection. But as
So many famous images that we've seen on the covers of other books, just one after another. It's like it's a greatest hits album.
well, somebody asked me earlier today that there's a lot of the pictures we've seen before. Why not publish? But I thought my answer was, I don't know if I'll ever do another India book. I could, but I could drop dead tomorrow. But I thought rather than do unpublished pictures of India, I wanted my first India book to be what I consider my best work and my favorite pictures. So it's
and there's a fair number of new work too.
Yeah,
There's a great deal.
It's a particular look at India. But it's my selection, for good or for bad. There's you could make a million criticisms about it, maybe about your text. No, it's great. No, I'm joking. But you put the work out there and let the chips fall where they may. I think I've had a love affair with India from almost the first time I stepped foot here, and the depth of culture. There's no place in the world like India. The ancient. It's an ancient civilization. There's a very strong connection between that past and the present. Often Indian culture permeates in other parts of the world. So it's a really strong, and there's all these religions, and you have this disparity between rich and poor, and the modern world and the ancient world. It's, I've been thinking back about where I've been in India and what I've done here, and I think I didn't go here, I didn't go there. There's vast areas of the country and the culture which I never saw, and I think I'll just have to keep coming back again.
And last question: future projects. We've got our Grand Trunk Road trip together.
I want to do some more work in Ethiopia. Cuba is someplace I'd like to go to. Iran, I may have a show in Iran in the near future. Place that in the American media, Iran's been demonized for decades, and I want to go for myself. And
I've just come back. It's the most amazing
I've
time
heard,
to be there. Yeah.
So these are some things that kind of keep me busy.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause, please, for Steve McCurry. We have time for one or two questions, I think, do we? Yeah, we have time for a few questions? Yep. You, sir.
Good morning, sir. I just want to know your experience to Vrindavan and Mathura, the holy festival that you have captured. So how was your experience for that?
Oh yeah, Vrindavan, and I went there the first time I went there was in I think 92, and it was the most amazing. It was a bit touristic, but I was on this wall. There were all these villagers. It was a very authentic. They were just going, It was amazing. It's one of the great. I think now it's become a bit more touristic, but. It was.
How do you, when everyone's throwing paint around, how do you make sure you don't get it all over the lens and this kind of stuff? There's.
Well, you have to be really careful, and you are a target, but and you get, you have to realize you're going to get color thrown on you, so that's just going to happen. But you want to try and keep it off. I just hoped, I just winged it, hoped for the best.
At the front here.
Hello.
Next one here. And then...
Hello, sir. Hello, sir.
Yep.
Hi. Here. I just want to know why you choose India to cover your last Kodachrome.
That's a good question. Yeah, I got the last. I requested the last roll of Kodachrome from Kodak, and I didn't have a clue what I was going to shoot. But the last manufactured roll of Kodachrome. So I wanted to photograph iconic places and people, And because Kodachrome was vanishing, I wanted to, I came up with the idea, okay, so I photographed Robert De Niro. Then we got on a plane. We went to Bombay. I photographed Amitabh Bachchan. I photographed Amir Khan, a couple other people I went to, and then I thought, because Kodachrome, this great iconic film, is vanishing. I wanted to go to a tribe in India, the Rabari, because this was one of the great tribes, and I wanted to spend some, because their way of life is coming
and they're big on color, Rabari.
Yeah. And this whole nomadic existence is coming to an end. So I thought I'll just do some poetic pictures of the Rabari.
So Rajasthan had the last, very last shots of Kodak ever taken.
Right. And then I went back to New York, and that was the project. But I thought that what better place to photograph part of the last roll of Kodachrome than India, where I've spent much of my career.
This one here, and then we had one. Who's got the camera? Pip here, and the lady with. Yeah. And then the silver-haired gentleman here.
Steve, back to the Afghan girl here. Can you set the scene for us? Were you walking by the tent? Did you go into the tent? Were there others around? And then also, what was it like meeting her again 17 years later?
What was it like?
Set the scene for. Were you walking by the tent? Were you in the tent? How did you find her? And also then, what was it like seeing her 17 years later?
Well, it was just complete happenstance. I'm walking through the camp. I heard these children's voices coming from the tent. I had nothing to do. It was getting close to lunchtime. And I thought, well, I'll just... Because the light was so harsh, I thought, well, maybe if I go into the tent, it'll be nice and soft. So I go in and got permission from the teacher. And the first thing I saw was her, the Sharbat Gula, with this incredible look and everything. I thought, my God, this is going to be an amazing. So I kind of set about trying to figure out how to do that. Eventually convinced her and some of her classmates to sit for me. And so that's how that worked. It was simple, particularly no particular story. And then we got thousands of letters, people wanting to know, who is she? We want to send her money, we want to send her clothes, we want to. Men wanted to marry her. It was this incredible thing. And so, years go by. I tried to find out who she was, and no luck. Everybody was telling me she's a little girl. She's an orphan. I mean, she's probably back in Afghanistan in some far-flung province. Anyway, it was like a miracle that we found her. I don't know how that happened.
How did it happen? I mean,
well, we took her picture and literally took her picture on the refugee camp, showed it to thousands of people in the camp. We got very lucky because we found the school and the teacher who had been in the classroom that day, and eventually we were able to find her brother. And of course, once we found her brother, we were able to find her. But the photograph...
And she was sort of prematurely aged. She was very... I mean, she looked much older than she...
And to photograph a Pashtun woman in a village in Afghanistan is like impossible. I mean, it's beyond impossible. But somehow through, our fixer and a wonderful journalist, we were able to convince her and more importantly, her husband, because he really is the one who gives the permission.
This gentleman here.
Steve, you obviously started off your career as a documentary photographer. I was wondering what percentage of your later work is shot spontaneously and what percentage is sort of set up?
Well, it's all spontaneous. If I'm in a portrait situation, obviously, I think with a portrait, you can pretty much do anything you want to. It's a collaboration between you and the subject. But I think you always have to, the pictures have to be authentic. You know, if you're taking a portrait of somebody, you want to make sure it's true to the culture. You wouldn't want to put a turban on somebody just for the sake of it being a better picture. But in journalism and what I do now, it's just literally wandering and exploring and trying to have fun and make your life worthwhile and fulfilling.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but please, let's hear it for Steve McCurry, one of the world's greatest photographers.
Can we please have everybody seated while we clear the aisles first, please? Steve will be signing his books. The book signing area is to the left. Please be seated. Can we please clear the aisles first? Thank you so much. You're like
Thank
my
God.
man. Stay here.
Across boundaries, we believe in bringing the world together through entertainment. Z Entertainment, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. The world is my family.
हीरे मोती से कब तुलती हैं खुशियाँ शोहरत तो दिल की कमां बाजार में कब बिकती हैं खुशियाँ शोहरत तो दिल की कमां दिल बड़ा तू बड़ा दिल बड़ा तू बड़ा दिल बड़ा तू बड़ा
अच्छाई की एक अलग चमक होती है रजनीगंधा सिल्वर पर्ल्स सिल्वर कोटेड इलायची
गेम्स मूवीज और म्यूजिक के 71 लाख 21,302 मिनट ये सब फिट होता है एक छोटी सी दुनिया में
Free music, movies and games only on Airtel, the smartphone network.
The humanities makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss about?
Nature of the human being, guilt and innocence?
It's like the pulsating brain of the universe.
More than a place, it's a spirit of inquiry.
Major intellectual crossroads of the universe.
There's a sense of curiosity, excitement.
Issues that won't stay still in one
The
discipline.
Humanities Center is really the beating heart of this university.
Amidst the color and vibrancy of the Jaipur Literature Festival, soak in the stimulating, thought-provoking sessions. Take a pause to catch your breath at our festival merchandise stalls. Choose from a range of products especially crafted to take the magic of the festival back home with you. All products will also be available online at directcreate.com/JLF16. Remember, you first saw them at JLF16.
Ford Endeavour. Designed for any terrain. Engineered for the extraordinary. Innovations in our most capable SUV, the all-new Ford Endeavour.
There's this magic about India.
अभी जितनी आज़ादी मिल गई है, जितना ज़्यादा फास्ट जा रहा है इंडिया हमारा, ये कुछ बता नहीं सकते.
There is nothing in this world that you can do. You just need to get yourself out of the bed and start doing it, man.
He was asking me, is it going to rain?
Our next session is called Surrogate Lives, presented by Dainik Bhaskar. We have Neera Syal in conversation with Aarti Prasad. We're going to be starting in just a few minutes. If you can all be seated, please.
They don't know the uses of internet. They can't imagine that internet can be used for education purpose. If you give these two tools, English language and internet, I can bet on this. It's going to change everything.
Hello guys, as you can see, this is my house and no Wi-Fi at my house. This is my neighbor come friend. No Wi-Fi in his house, but yes, Wi-Fi is there at his neighbor's house. Yeah, so me and my friend come neighbor sit here and used my neighbor's house Wi-Fi. India is a country of brotherhood. We have one Wi-Fi router, but 5 families use that Wi-Fi router.
It's 4 o'clock in the evening. I'm currently standing outside my house on my field. What technology brings to here is truly amazing. It can change people's lives. I work as a web developer from my own house, from my own bedroom, and now I have 10 Mbps fiber optic Wi-Fi. About 5 years ago, we didn't even have proper dial-up connection. It's amazing how a simple internet connection can change people's lives. I can now make amazing mobile apps from my own house.
There are so many things about India which are just amazing.
We have so much people here, and the diversity.
If you think that you are not capable of doing anything, you are wrong.
Communication, education, technology, transportation, population, politician. We are gonna make this nation. We are gonna develop this nation. I am a citizen of a very great and wise country, and I am proud of it.
I'm just going to announce the session. We have a small video playing for Derek Pastor and Teamworks, and then you can start. It's all yours.
So again, you have a video and then we
Yeah.
start. Okay. Tell us what's going on. This is beautiful. Yeah, it's amazing.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 9th Jaipur Literature Festival at Mahindra Humanities Centre Durbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce our next session, Surrogate Lives, and it is sponsored by Dainik Bhaskar. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Meera Sayal in conversation with Aarti Prasad. Over to you, ma'am.
Meera, I wanted to start by talking a bit about you because you're like a Renaissance woman. I mean, you're a actress, comedian, writer. When you do write a book, how do you choose what topic to write it on? How did you come to choose this?
Well, it's been 16 years since my last book, so I don't have the good ideas very often. I don't really start writing until there's something that really makes me tingle at the back of my neck and makes me want to sit up and start that long, lonely process of writing. In this case, I was channel flicking one night, and I came across an image of a row of obviously very poor Indian women, all heavily pregnant, sitting on beds. And it looked like it could have been a girls' boarding school. And I was so intrigued. I thought, what is this? I continued watching the documentary and found out about the Indian surrogacy industry, that it was the biggest in the world, worth $4.5 billion a year. And I had no idea that it existed. And my immediate thought was, how would I feel if I had to hire a surrogate? And then the next thought was, that's what I want to write about. I want to write about a British Indian woman who finds an Indian surrogate. And what really, really intrigued me was the relationship between the two women, that these two women, for 9 months, absolutely need each other and hold the key to each other's dreams to change their lives, and yet they're complete strangers.
I've heard those houses described as fertility reality TV shows or like Big Brother houses. But what was really interesting, because you wrote about it, you see these women and you see them pregnant and you make assumptions about who they are, but you brought the character to life. So I wanted to ask you, how did you research it? How did you go about finding out about these women and their lives?
Well, actually, you can do a large amount of research online, because that's, in fact, how most of the foreign couples do their research. They're not in the country. So I did quite a lot of, almost to the point of signing up, actually, for clinics, just to see what the process was like. I talked to a lot of fertility doctors in Britain, and I
signed up to the clinics?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, just for the first few stages, just to see how far I could get before they asked really personal questions. And also I met a couple in London, a British Indian couple who'd had 2 children by 2 different surrogates and had had very different experiences, one very good, one very bad. So they were invaluable for a lot of the emotional background, because on paper it's statistics, but actually as a writer what you're interested in, I don't really care about the statistics, I care about the emotional journey behind it and what does that actually mean? How does that feel? Firstly, it's the pain of being an infertile woman, longing for a baby. Women, as we know, are always judged when they can't produce children, so for an Indian woman it's a big burden still. Society dictates that. And what is it like to carry someone else's child, to carry a life for 9 months and give that child away? I mean, these are huge, epic emotions, and at the end of it, there is a living being, there's a child. So, for me, the subject area touched on all the things I wanted to write about, the politics of fertility, the ownership of women's bodies. I thought surrogacy was a great metaphor for the relationship between India and the West. What is it like being a woman of the diaspora that returns to India to hire a surrogate? Is she a colonial exploiter, or is she actually changing a woman's life? It's such a complex area and has so many layers. So that's when I got the tingle. That's when I wanted to write again.
Did you actually manage to visit a clinic?
No, I didn't actually visit any clinics in India.
I was telling you earlier that when I was in university, I was 20 years old, and I was doing a research project on male infertility. And so I was studying sperm. And I realized
Bet your mum loved that. What did you do today, darling? Well, I'm studying sperm.
Nothing, Mummy.
Go to your room.
It was quite horrible, the experiments, because there was in mice, and mice have testes that are internal, so you had to cut them out. But I thought it was quite funny, because the same protein I was looking for in the testes we thought was expressed in the brain, so that was quite a, well, made some sense.
Doesn't it?
But I had the thought that someone's spending millions and millions and millions of pounds on this research, and as a 20-year-old who wasn't thinking about a family at all, I couldn't understand why anyone would be so desperate, so why all of this money was being sunk into it. And I wanted to ask you about your personal experience, because you had a child early and then you had a child later on. I guess you must have brought some of your own life experience into this, or you felt some of your emotions. Was it cathartic?
I guess. I mean, my central character is called Sharma. She's a 48-year-old woman, so clearly she's not going to carry a baby naturally. But for Sharma, it's not that she's never had children. She's been married before, a very unhappy first marriage, which has produced a daughter called Tara. She's finally met the love of her life, Toby, who is English and 20 years her junior, so her toy boy. But it's true love. She adores him. He's desperate for children. She's desperate to give him a child. So I think that I certainly understand the yearning for a child. I remember that. And I think all of us that have been thinking about having children have always, the next step you think is, what happens if I can't? What are my options? Thankfully for most of us, it happens. But I have so many very close friends that have been through the agony of infertility, so it was very easy for me to tap into that yearning. And I also wanted to make Sharma this age, because in the first draft she was 44, and the feedback
you were 44 when you had your son.
And the feedback I was getting from readers was, it's not a big deal at 44 anymore, really, to have a child. And I wanted to make Sharma almost 50. I wanted to make her the age where people would say, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? So that her choices are more complicated, but also we have to ask ourselves the question, when do you stop, and who says you should stop? Because science makes it possible to go on and on and on.
Well, just the fact that people think 44 isn't too old, because medically in England, once you're past 35, you're considered an older mother. But because these technologies allow possibilities that they weren't before,
yeah.
I think as a society, or you look at Hollywood, older mothers having babies, and you don't necessarily know how that came about, but you just see a woman with a baby who's older, and you think, yep. I've spoken to the British Infertility Society, and they say that really impacts. Because people say, of course you can have children later. Look at this actress or that actress.
Yeah.
Not really knowing what went into it. But I had the thought last night that my father, when I was born, my father was 42 and my mother was 28. Of course, that way around, there's no issue.
Of course not.
But women have this
Absolutely.
ticking biological clock.
Well, that's the thing we all have to live with. I mean, I can't remember. I think it was in When Harry Met Sally. There's this wonderful line where someone says, "Well, Charlie Chaplin had children into his 80s," and somebody else says, "Yeah, but he was too old to pick them up." And you do have this double standard all the time. It's the same in movies. You know, it's okay for a 60-year-old actor to have a girlfriend who's 30, but God forbid it's the other way around. And those same sort of double standards, I guess, apply to the whole fertility thing. You know, we do have the clock, and that makes a big difference. But, you know, there are many people that would argue, well, if science makes it possible to have the length of choice that men have to choose to be parents, why shouldn't we do that?
I've heard comments from people that, oh, it's not natural, this isn't natural. The menopause happens, it happens for a reason. Who wants to have periods all their lives? But, you know, there's so many medical interventions that happen to stop things that aren't natural, like incubators or pacemakers, and people
Absolutely.
don't argue against that. But I think there's a lot of talk about the desire to have a child later in life. I think this is a very significant time in the world because, you know, there's a lack of women in higher rungs of everything, government, media, companies, banks. And women now are really asked something quite difficult because we have the same education. We go to university during the same time and we start our careers during what are the most fertile years of our lives. So we need to make choices. And if you postpone having a child until you're later in your 30s or 40s, things get more difficult. So,
Absolutely. People are so quick to judge, I think, a woman particularly who chooses to have children later, but there is a whole raft of reasons. Sometimes you just haven't found the right person, sometimes you've been unlucky in love, sometimes it's just taken you so long to get pregnant, or you can't get pregnant, or it's a second marriage and you want children, and as in Sharma's cases. I mean, there are many, many reasons. So the one thing I did learn, I mean, I had a very knee-jerk reaction, I have to say, when I started researching surrogacy, and I still have worries about it because essentially it's a deregulated industry, and while it's deregulated, there are going to be abuses. But I did see another side when I did meet the people whose lives have been transformed by having surrogate children.
There are also lots of medical conditions that women have. Young women, millions of women have either absent wombs or badly shaped wombs, or have had cancer when they're young, or hysterectomies. But what did you find when you were doing your research about where couples come from? Where do they come from when they come to India to find surrogacy clinics?
Well, they're overwhelmingly foreign couples, probably up to 80% actually. So it's a large number. I don't know if you know, but there's a bill going through Indian Parliament at the moment, which, if it's passed, would actually limit the whole surrogacy industry to heterosexual, married Indian couples.
Indian couples?
Yeah, there will be no foreign surrogacy at all, and that really will change the industry profoundly.
Do you think I just want to talk about money for a bit, because in England you can't pay a surrogate. You can have a surrogate, but it has to be altruistic. And that's quite a hard thing to ask someone to do. I suppose, and you talk about this in the book, that you know, in the olden days, I had friends from Pakistan who had 5 daughters, and one of them was given to a brother because he was childless. There were ways that people got around it.
Right.
But to ask a friend or a sister to have a child for you, it's not an easy thing. So payment isn't allowed, but you can pay expenses.
Yeah.
But stopping the Indian, regulating the commercialization of surrogacy in India will, I guess, have a massive impact on people around the world, because you talk about affordability.
Yeah, well, that's why it's the biggest in the world. Let's be blunt, it's the cheapest. It's the cheapest.
It's the cheapest for foreigners, but what about the women? Because I read that there was something that equated to about 15 years of a salary for the women.
It's a huge amount for the poor, mostly uneducated rural women that become surrogates. It is life-changing. And you know, that's why it's such a complex situation morally. That's why it's so great to write about, because Sharma can see on the one hand, you know, feels the guilt of, am I doing the right thing? Is this terribly exploitative? And on the other hand, can see that this will change Mala's life. It will enable her to send her kids to school, to buy a house, to give her financial independence, which she's never had. But there is always a price, somewhere.
Obviously, in India, you don't have wealthy women becoming surrogates. It's something that women do. Clearly, they do it for this reason, for the money. And so I guess if you haven't met one of these women, or you haven't thought about it too much, you'd have a preformed opinion about what kind of woman that would be. And I was very interested to learn about the character you chose for Mala, who's the surrogate mother, who's a girl from a village, who has had a limited education because, like many girls, she's taken out of school at puberty with the idea of getting her married. She just talk a bit about how she realizes, because there's a very interesting part about her neighbor who was pregnant and goes off to, and I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a reading, but just give the background to that chapter.
Well, Mala is, it was really important to me when I wrote the character of the surrogate that Mala was as complex and intelligent as Sharma, that you should feel when you read Mala's story that if she'd had the chances and opportunities that Sharma had, she would be in Sharma's shoes. She'd be running a company. She'd have a life full of choices. Because I am really fascinated by the untapped potential of women, the wasted potential of women. You know, I grew up around a lot of disappointed women when I was growing up. Not my mother so much, but, you know, a lot of her friends, you could see the lives that they hadn't led, the opportunities that they hadn't had, the compromises they had to make. And I do remember thinking, I don't want that to be me. And I think that was a big spur in the kind of work I wanted to do.
It's interesting in the book because you talk about the surrogates here and certain abuses that happen in India. You mention acid attacks, I think. You mention infanticide. You mention the Delhi rape. But you also talk about women in the UK, so friends of Sharma's, who've had bad marriages or had abusive marriages or haven't been able to fulfill their... So it's almost like it kind of doesn't matter where you are. There's this universal theme
Totally.
that women put up with a lot.
They do, but they are also incredibly strong. And, you know, the strength, what you go through makes you stronger. But I think that certainly in Mala's case, you see that she's from a tiny rural community where there's been so much female infanticide for a start that there are so many less girls than boys.
And that's why she doesn't know about surrogacy at this point.
No.
She assumes that her neighbor has gone to Delhi to have an abortion.
So there is a section in the book where Mala's in the village and it's a tiny village, and they've noticed that there's a neighbor called Seema who has disappeared mysteriously for a few months and come back and is suddenly very rich. And Mala's trying to figure out why.
The washing machine arrives and the TV arrives,
Yes. So do you want me to read that
yes,
section?
Please.
I don't know how I'm going to do this holding a microphone, actually. I've worked it out. Even though Seema cried constantly, Mala could not stop eating. The more Seema sniffed and dripped, the more food Mala piled onto her plate, as if she could concentrate better whilst chewing. If she could have eaten the plate itself, she would have done. It was so wafer thin that when she held it up towards the light, she could see her fingers on the other side. Around the edge was a regular looping design, which on closer inspection revealed itself to be a chain of tiny elephants, each holding onto the tail of the one in front with its trunk. The detail was so clever and delicate, the folds and wrinkles of their hide hanging like just-washed winter blankets, their sad, rheumy eyes, the tender pink tips of their trunks. How many hours must it have taken to paint even one, Mala marvelled, before she dumped another handful of colourful pastries over the pattern. It was clear that Seema had not had many visitors, if any, since her return from the capital. The eager desperation with which she had unpacked boxes of expensive sweetmeats had embarrassed Mala. until she took in the obvious trophies around the room. A new sofa and armchairs in a floral pattern. A nest of tables, daddy, mummy and baby size, all fitting inside one another. 4 new lamps over-illuminated the room, one in each corner, with heavy fringed shades in which a couple of fuzzy moths already fluttered helplessly. The new fridge freezer sat against a wall, emitting a low-pitched, absent-minded hum, like a simple relative who'd come to visit and been forgotten about. And the purchase that really made Mala draw breath. Up on the wall, with several wires hanging from its frame, hung a huge, thin television screen, like a window into another world, still dark and waiting to be opened. "My husband can't work it yet," Seema sniffed. Mala ate another snack in one gulp and, finally satisfied, licked her glittered fingertips and settled back into her chair. "So," said Mala, "you went to Delhi and they took your baby away." The shock of Mala's question finally stopped Seema in mid-flow. She opened her mouth, then nodded her head. Her tears threatened to start all over again. "Either cry or speak. You can't do both," Mala snapped. Seema wiped her nose on her sari. How did you know? Who told you?" "Bas, no one had to tell me anything. Everyone saw you were pregnant. You went to Delhi, you came back with no baby and a new handbag." "He told me not to tell anyone." No need to say who he was. The he was the same in everybody's lives. "It was his idea, the whole thing, but then I said yes. I mean, he didn't force me." Mala made one of those all-purpose, non-committal ha-ha noises that might encourage Seema to spill some more details. "Afterwards I felt glad, but also sad, crying all the time. Stupid, huh? I should be happy with all this." She waved a limp hand around the room. "And now we can send the children to the proper school in Bassian, and college also if they work hard at their studies, and we can give my bubbly a good wedding when the time comes." Mala's toes curled with curiosity. Just how much money did this mouse-quiet, mumbly woman have? "I know people must be saying dirty things about me," Seema said softly. "It's a strange thing to understand, even for me sometimes." "What is not to understand?" Mala retorted. "It happens all the time." "Does it?" Seema asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. Of course. It's just you did it with a proper doctor. At least this way, you won't bleed to death like a halal chicken afterwards, like poor Jussie in my old village." Seema looked confused. Then she mumbled something, which made Mala sit up straight. What? What did you just say?" Seema looked up at Mala, eyes tinged with wonder. It was a girl with blue eyes, so bright blue, like a peacock's neck. "When I was crying afterwards, my husband said, 'You are just the nest, not the egg. The bird gets strong and then flies away. What is there to be upset about, especially when these people are giving us so much pesa?' But how would he understand? He did not feel her knees making bumps in my belly. He did not see his skin jump like the river when the rain falls on it, when she got hiccups. He did not feel her flip like a fish under my ribs. He did not have to push her out with legs so far apart that one foot is in life and the other is in death, did he?" Mala nodded, her lips clamped shut, fireworks blooming noiselessly in her head. 5 minutes later, she had the whole picture, every detail. Once uncorked, Seema could not be stopped, so Mala just listened. And as she listened, she began to understand finally why her husband had been spending so much time with Seema's husband, why he would not touch her anymore, why he looked at her the way he did, not seeing her breasts and belly as his, but as valuable treasures for hire.
Just before this, Mala is wondering why her husband's not sleeping with her. And he's obviously been talking to Seema's husband.
Yeah.
And he's staring at her and he's looking at her almost like she's a commodity. And so in this story, it was her husband's idea that this is a way of bringing money into the family.
It starts as her husband's idea, but actually what Mala finds is that this is the most freedom and opportunity she's ever had. And Mala gradually embraces it, and actually what you see happening between Mala and Shama, and this was the bit of the story that really made me wanted to tell it, is how the power balance between the two women shift, because Mala suddenly realizes for the first time in her life she is powerful. This is the most power she's ever had, and she sees opportunity and she wants to better her life. This is a woman with huge intelligence and potential who's never had a chance to express it. So in a way, even though it was her husband's idea, the surrogacy somehow becomes her passport to a different kind of life.
I wonder what impact it had on you going through all of this, because I wonder if you... Is this kind of surrogacy exploitative? Do you think so? Because on the one hand, that power exchange happens. Mala discovers she has opportunities she's never had. She has money. She things she could never dream of. And she doesn't tell her family what she's doing, does she? She kind of...
No. I mean, a lot of surrogates can't. They have to keep it quiet because the stigma of returning back to the rural communities.
But by the same token, because when I was writing my book about the future of fertility, I have a chapter on artificial wombs. It's a great equalizer. You know, if a woman can plan when she has a baby, not have to take the 9 months off, or equally if a man could do it, then you know, these are routes so as not to use another woman's body. And I interviewed an ethicist who said just that. She said, this is one of the last ways that one woman exploits the body of another woman. And there's a section in the book where I think Mala and Shama meet, and quite soon after that, Shama wants to get to know her better, which I think is frowned upon by the clinic.
Yes.
But she goes shopping with her, and then they go back to her house, which I
a friendship starts, because Shama doesn't want to be thought of as an exploiter. She doesn't want to see this woman just as an oven. She wants to see her as a person.
Yeah. But at that point, you described them walking past I think it was a prostitute and a pimp situation where a prostitute was being maybe bullied or something. And Mala and Shama hug, and she looks at the prostitute and she said, you have her say this. Mala kept looking over Shama's shoulder to the woman's small hut with its plastic curtain and thought, we are not so different, Benji. We have to sell the only thing we almost own. And so there's an inkling there that I'm using the only resource I have.
Well, but that's true. I mean, this is the only thing Mala has that is seen as valuable. And that's why she has this moment of connection with I mean, for me, this is an issue still about the ownership of a woman's body and how that is used. So there are deep ethical issues attached to it, no doubt. But the thing is, it's here and it's going to keep happening. So given that, how can we make it safe? How can we make it safer for the women?
I'm also interested in the ethical issues related to the children, because there's this idea that, I don't know, in human rights, that no child should be stateless. And yet you hear all of these stories, like the Japanese couple you talk about. That was in the news, where what happened was a couple ordered a baby and then separated.
Yeah, and didn't want the baby, so left the baby at the clinic. There have been a few cases like that. And also because there's no international surrogacy law in countries where it's illegal. There have been cases, I think there was a French man who had twins, tried to take them back into France because surrogacy is totally illegal in France. The children were put into foster care, taken off him. I mean, ridiculous situations because there is no international agreement yet. It's such a new industry.
And if, in some countries, the mother is considered to be the woman who gives birth to the child,
Right.
and in other countries it's the genetic
Yeah.
donor. So you can have a child who's floating around potentially.
Yes, it's a very strange situation. But there is a reason that I used a quote from The Handmaid's Tale at the front of this book, which is one of my favourite books. Wonderful Margaret Atwood is here with us, actually, and I thanked her for allowing me to use the quote. But for me, The Handmaid's Tale is an absolutely prophetic book. It's almost as if Margaret Atwood saw this coming. She saw a dystopian future where fertility would be an industry and would actually not be in the hands of the women that are the fertile women.
And just to go back to the babies, so there's this idea, there's a problem of statelessness potentially, or being rejected, and then the surrogate mother can't look after it, and the person who ordered it doesn't want to take it back. But what about the case of, have you come across disabilities, and so the children are born with disabilities, or they're not quite what the parents thought it would be, the genetic parent. What happens to these children?
Well, that's a very interesting... I mean, there have been cases where, there's something wrong with it, so I don't want it, so you take it back. That has happened. To be fair, there are couples where that has happened and they have embraced the child that they've been given. But I think that's the real moral test, isn't it, of what this actually means, if there is something wrong with the child. If it was your child, you'd have a very different attitude. This is a child you'd carried for 9 months, and there was something wrong with it when it was born. I suspect you would have a very different attitude to something that had been carried by a surrogate.
What about, do you get a sense of, because technically a surrogate mother in India is not the genetic mother, because she's not supposed to be using her own eggs. So these women go through quite an intense process. I mean, sperm donation, easy, pleasurable even. Egg donation, series of injections.
Yeah, it's
you
horrible.
Feel nauseous, sick. So Mala acted as an egg donor as well. So the women who go into the clinic, they're going to carry babies, but because they're young women, they're also asked if they'll donate. That's a funny term, I think, donating eggs. You're not really donating, it's quite an intense thing. But the women also tend to give eggs as part of it. Is that what you discovered?
They can do, yes, that's one of the options. I mean, these are all things that I gradually found out, but to be honest, I know you're a scientist. I was much less interested in the science. I felt that was homework and I had to do it.
But you did write some...
Yeah, I had to get it right, because I know that people like you with scientific minds will be going, that's wrong. But honestly, really, what I'm interested in is the human story. That is what I was interested in. And it works as a part thriller in a way, because Mala and Sharma, in a way, the power balance is like a seesaw and it shifts. And in the middle of them is Toby, who is suddenly there's a... I don't want to give the plot away, but through various circumstances. You need to read the book. Mala actually ends up living with them, and now that's when you cannot treat someone as merely a carrier when they are a person living in your home, and that was part of the moral complexity I wanted to explore. Is that it's very easy to say I'm hiring you, but that is a real person there with real emotions carrying a real child. And what is that emotional impact for a couple, and for the three of them?
The other moral complexity you touched on, and the reason I was talking about donating eggs, is because technically a surrogate mother shouldn't be carrying her own egg, because then it'll be her own genetic child as well as her biological, if she's giving birth to it. And I wondered how, I mean, some women clearly must get attached to that baby, and it must be a wrench to give it up. Did you get that sense?
I'm sure that happens. I mean...
even if the baby's born with blue eyes and is white and clearly isn't their child.
How could you not, though? I mean, that passage I just read was... You heard how Seema described how she felt when she had to give the baby away. And, well, I can't imagine. I mean, having had children myself, I can't imagine having just given birth that however much you can say, that's genetically not my child, it's lived in you for 9 months. How could you not be attached, and your whole body is prepared to feed that child for months and look after it, and suddenly it's gone? I mean, that must be traumatic.
Scientifically, I see a surrogate mother as a third parent, because she's not donating the DNA code, but it has lived in her body, and it will be influenced by her nutrition, by how she was nourished as a child.
Absolutely.
So there's signatures that child's going to get that says, this kind of was my mother. My body thinks that was my mother, even though my genes know that it's not.
That's a whole other area, isn't it? The genetic memory and what you're taking from, I know.
And at one point, you also talk about alternative families. That's something I was quite interested in, because here Mala comes to England, she's living with Shama and Toby, and there's an older daughter in the house as well. And so you have this situation where there's a genetic father, surrogate mother, egg from
It's
somewhere.
what's known as the blended family.
Blended
There are
family.
a lot of us. That's the
Yeah.
modern way. Yeah, but that is the reality of a lot of families now. We're not 2.4 nuclear families anymore. There are all kinds of permutations.
And life doesn't always turn out the way. It's not a Disney film, is it?
It's not a Disney film. Indeed, it isn't. But I think, the idea of what makes a parent is a very interesting question because, to be honest, Sharma has not been the best parent to the child she already has, and yet she wants to make another one. And the relationship, Sharma's daughter Tara is appalled by what she's doing. She's a teenager, and here's a mother, a 48-year-old mother having a baby, so you can imagine the tension that creates. And also, I think there's a whole subplot, actually, which has nothing to do with surrogacy, but has had, actually, ironically, a lot more reaction, certainly from British Indians, than the surrogacy issue. And Sharma's parents live at the bottom of her garden, as Indian parents do. And they have put money into a flat in Delhi. And they've been, this is their retirement home, and they've been sending money back for years. And then the father makes a mistake of allowing some of his relatives to move into the flat. And you can guess what happens next. The relatives won't move out. And so you follow her parents going through the Indian court system trying to get this property back. This was taken directly from something that happened in my own family, and it truly broke my father's heart. And it's such a big NRI issue. There are so many NRIs that have been in this situation where they've basically, the home that they thought they would retire to is no longer there. And often it's members of your own family that are fighting you for it, and it causes this terrible rift. But I was so interested in the idea of what is home. What is home for people? For Sharma's parents, home was always going to be India. It was the place they were born in. It was the place they wanted to return to. All of that is taken away. And yet for Tara, who's the third generation, who's never really been to India, India becomes the place she wants to return to. And so the whole issue of, where do you belong? Who is your parent? What is your home? I hope I've tried to explore in the subplot as well.
Yeah, I wanted to explore that a bit with you. We're both, I guess, have a similar second-generation immigrants in England, and you have, at one point in the book, referred to Sharma's dilemma as also going to India to do this because it's kind of a colonial thing. It's sort of, I'm going back to a country, I'm going back with money that I have because my parents left that country, and I'm paying a poor woman in this country to carry a child for me, which is, a very kind of intimate thing to ask someone to do and hand over money to them. And also that Tara comes to India and she works here and she learns Hindi and she speaks better Hindi than her mother. And so there are themes of identity and migration in this book, but also your other books as well, because it's something that, it's such a shared experience of people who leave and then want to... I think I call myself thoroughly British because my raison d'etre was the empire. My father was born in the Caribbean. His father was taken as an indentured labourer. And then he drove to India and met my mother here, who was born in May 1947, so she was also British, I guess, when she was born. And then I've been spending a lot of time here, but the idea of what is home and what do we take from India, and in the meantime, India's changed completely.
I know, well, that's the irony, isn't it? That is something that happens, I think, to us as a diaspora community, that, as you grow up, your parents often are clinging on to the Indian values they left 30 years ago, and they don't realise that India's changing.
Baji on the Beach touched on this a lot, didn't it?
Yeah, but I've had it my whole life. I remember the first time I went to India on my own, without family. I was in my early 20s. And I thought, I'll dress in my best salwar kameez, and, I'm going to look thoroughly Indian, and they won't say that's the horrible Western girl there, because I'll show them. And I walked off the plane, and my cousin sort of ran up in a pair of jeans and a T-shirt and went, "Oh my God, what are you wearing? It's like 30 years out of date. Come for pizza." I was like, what? But I'm being a good Indian girl. And, I'd so got it wrong, and that happens a lot, I think. It's what expats do all over the world. We have this nostalgic view of what it means, what the motherland means. But actually, if you don't come here, if you don't keep in touch with what's going on here, you have a completely rose-coloured view of it. And I think that it's kind of important to keep in touch because there's a lot of myths we try and live up to of what it means to be a good Indian woman, and actually, you know, a lot of them are dead and gone, and we need to...
It's being challenged anyway.
Yeah, and culture moves. Culture is fluid, it moves all the time, as it should, and we need to keep up with that.
I remember being here, I know about 20 years ago, and I was watching, no less, and I was watching MTV, and it was Valentine's Day, and they were talking about boyfriends on TV in India, and I was, what?
I know.
You wouldn't say that to your parents in England.
You wouldn't get away with it. You'd get the chapel, wouldn't you? That'd be it.
Okay. When you were talking about the women in England, Sharma's contemporaries, Sharma divorces and she sets up a beautician salon, which Mala then ends up working in and brings her mysterious homemade village beauty skills to. But Sharma was juggling her daughter, and you said she wasn't probably the best mother to her, but she set up this business and she was a career woman. And women tend to do that, don't they? They tend to take the burden of motherhood even if they're working, and studying and everything else, even in the situation of a married couple.
Mm.
And so I wanted to ask you, not about the content of the book, but about writing. How do you do it and where do you find the time? What kind of writer are you? Is it sitzfleisch? Are you a morning person, evening person? How do you juggle all of it?
You kind of... You know, when you've got children and you're paying for very expensive childcare, that really focuses the mind, I can tell you. So you have to treat it like a job. So my creative hours are when my son's at school, really, and, you know, that's it. You just have to clock in and clock off. And in some ways it's kind of good. I mean, before I had kids, I would write all through the night, wherever I felt like it. And I don't think I actually produced any better work. So I think there is something, you know, there are lots of things that motherhood takes away from you in terms of time and energy and stuff, but actually there's a lot that motherhood gives back. I think my creativity has become sharper since I've become a mother. I use my time better. I make better choices. And your heart grows bigger. You know, your empathy for the entire human race is just, you know, triples because you're a mother. It's like your nerve endings are on your skin all the time in the first few months, and you suddenly understand things a lot in a very different and profound way, and for a writer that's a brilliant gift. So I've been a working mother for 23 years, so really for most of my career that's what I've been. So I try and treat it like a job. I know where to clock off, and I have faith that if I'm stuck, if I just go and do something not to do with writing, it'll unblock itself, and kids are great for that as well.
I met a scientist in Israel who said she only ever employed mothers because they were efficient. They got the job done.
And you get brilliant at time management. I now understand why those Hindu goddesses have so many arms. It's the only way to do it, isn't it?
And it also brings up the point of the great desire people have to have a child, which some people may not understand, because there are people who don't want children, and there are people who want children. It's when that sort of Venn diagram of someone who wants a child can't. You know, the person who doesn't want a child, who might be able to have one, is making a choice.
Right.
The person who wants a child but can't have one should also be allowed that choice.
It's all about choice, isn't it? I mean, that's really the basis of feminism, really. People want to dress it up in all kinds of scary F-word cliches, but actually that's all. Any woman should be able to have the same choices and the fuller choices that are available to men. I mean, it's that simple. And neither of the women in the story do, for various reasons. For Mala, they're economic. For Sharma, they're to do with age. You know, facing up to the end of your fertility is a huge thing.
And I suppose it's interesting because Sharma's choice led to Mala initially not having a choice. I mean, she took the opportunity, but it's the way it's
but if we don't give away the ending, it doesn't. The ending will surprise people. I think. I think you feel at the end of it, everyone's choices have changed very profoundly. Are we going to take some questions?
It's transformative, yeah. So we're going to open the floor to questions now. This is a lady at the front.
So what actually happens if there is something wrong with the child and the people who ordered it say, I don't want it? I mean, what happens at that point? Is there a political solution, or is there a regulation about that?
I don't actually know I don't think there is any regulation about it, because I don't think that's the problem. It's a deregulated industry at the moment. I suspect it varies from clinic to clinic. I know there have been cases of disabled children abandoned. The parents didn't want them. Is that right?
Yes, and someone said to me it might be even worse. I mean, who knows where the children are going or what's happening to them. I mean, there is infanticide anyway, so there's no records. There are no records kept, and there's no regulation.
It's still so new.
Someone at the back in black.
I remember you, Mirasiel, from a very small role you've done in a film about 20 years ago called A Beautiful Thing.
Oh, yes.
With you wearing a sari and kicking a football around.
Yeah, that sounds like me.
My question has to do with how you've seen families change in that time, in 20 years' time, whether you've seen sort of turfs develop, which are sort of fiercely guarded between how British Indians and the diaspora, I don't know if fit in is the right word, it sort of meld in and exist and experience reality as it is across the UK outside of London, and how that informed your decisions for this book.
Well, what I've seen is what is happening everywhere. I think that the whole concept of the sort of traditional 2.4 kids family is just changing profoundly because of divorce and second marriages and step-parents and whatever else. And there's a new way of relating to each other. There are new kinds of families, and that's happening in our community the same as everywhere else. So, and like any other family, there are good ones and bad ones. I mean, I think it just comes down to actually just going with a new honesty that I hope we have. The generation I see coming up, you know, are much more able to talk to their parents, talk about stuff that bothers them, and all of that stuff I find, you know, very refreshing and certainly different to how I grew up.
So, my mother's addicted to these Indian soap operas on these TV channels, and they have these interesting storylines. And I swear to you, she's changed she's come out with the funniest things about gay people or gay couples, and it's because she's seen it on telly.
That's the power of telly, and great that it starts the debate.
The lady in the glasses on this side, and then the lady at the back, please.
Hi, I'm Parul. Ma'am, I want to know, is there any study or research done on the psyche of the child who comes to know later on that whom he considers his mother is not the one who has given him birth, and how he copes with that situation?
Well, certainly in the clinics that I researched, part of the legal contract that's drawn up is the surrogate child has no resource to ever find the surrogate parent. So effectively, certainly it's different from clinic to clinic, but I think it's common that the surrogate will sign a legal agreement and that the child is never able to trace them.
I mean, technically they can have the DNA sequence, but the problem with the Indian government doesn't allow DNA to really leave, so the Indian genome isn't easy to compare it to other. You know, you can't search. It's going to be very, very difficult to have anonymity there and find a parent. And there was the lady right at the back in the corner.
Hi. So my question is that Mala is making money, right? Out of, she's delivering a baby, but she's making money. So isn't that women empowerment in some way? She is financially independent. She can use that money for, buying handbags and stuff. So I want to ask that, it lies somewhere in the gray area, right? So is that not women empowerment, and is that not feminism?
Well, sure, that's why it's such a complicated issue, because for all the people that will condemn surrogacy, there are people on the other side that will say exactly what you said, that for some women, this money is absolutely life-changing. It gives them choices that they could not get any other way, because often they're uneducated, they can't get a job that would ever pay them that much money. That's why it's so complex, and that's why I've really tried in the book to be completely, I hope, open-handed or even about the arguments, because I think it really depends where you're standing on that complex issue. If you're the woman that is desperate for a child, you'll have one view. If you're the surrogate who can put their kids through school, you'll have another view. If you are, you know, the social worker who has to take away a disabled child because nobody wants it, you will have another view.
And the point where Mala kind of equates herself a little bit to the prostitute because they're selling something. I wrote a story once on lap dancing clubs in London. One of them I visited was an Indian one, so like a dance club where women are fully clothed and the lights are on, but men are throwing money at them. And some of these women, I heard, their passports were taken away and they were kept upstairs. Yeah. But in the English sort of lap dancing club, completely different. Women were completely naked. They were making a lot of money. A lot of them were master's students. I remember one of them gave me a lecture on Nazi Germany after the session. So they were being educated. They were surviving. And there was a Brazilian barman, and he said to me, "Man, these women make so much money. If I was a woman, I'd do it." But then there was some Russian women who came in with translators, and they never accepted them because the bouncers always knew that these women were being trafficked. So it's both things.
Yeah.
For some it's exploitation, for some they're exploiting the men, actually.
Mira, I've got a question here. You've created two wonderful female characters in your book. At the end of writing them, did you have a favourite and why?
Oh, I'm not sure. I love them both equally, and they're almost the same woman. They're almost, you know, I always felt when I was writing it that if Mala had had Sharma's opportunities, that she would be Sharma. If Sharma's parents had never left for Britain, she would be Mala. So for me, they're two sides of the same coin. I think you have to fall in love with all of your characters when you're writing them. Sharma, of course, you know, has a lot of, has a lot of the stuff coming out of her mouth that I've said to my girlfriends and thought. And that was like, you know, writing is therapy, isn't it? We all do it. You kind of get to say the stuff that's been in your head for years. With Mala, it was so interesting. She kind of jumped onto the page. When I started writing her, she came out in the first person. It was like she really wanted to speak and she wanted to be heard. And that was a fantastic drive when I was writing her. She was so vivid in there. And that was a very different experience writing both characters. I couldn't choose, actually. In fact, I love Toby too. I mean, I genuinely think even the characters that are unlikable, you as the writer have to really love them somewhere. They're still your children, and with all their flaws, you love them when you put them on the page.
I love Toby. And it's true what you're saying about Mala. When I started reading the Mala chapters, I couldn't stop reading.
I know, she's so vivid, isn't she? Yeah.
Being a very emotional person myself, I just thinking on one line, what if the surrogate mother decides not to give away the child, part away with the child, and okay, no money, nothing I want. I just want my child. I don't know.
that I'm sure that does happen. Well, they don't get any money, and then sometimes they're asked to pay all the medical expenses, which of course a lot of them can't do. So to be honest, they don't really have much choice, most of the women. If they look at the contract, they want to keep the child, well then say, okay, well you owe us this much money, and they don't have the money. It's very hard choice.
Yeah, I want to ask two questions to Dr. Aarti Prasad. Yeah, in your book, Like a Virgin, you wrote about women's ability to reproduce by herself.
Can you speak a bit more slow? Can you stand up?
Yeah, in your book, Like a Virgin, you wrote about a woman's ability to reproduce by herself. And so I want to know about, what do you think about the concept of designer babies?
I think it's very difficult to design a baby. When you think about that, you think, what would parents ask for? High IQ, I don't know. You can control eye color and hair color and skin color to a degree. You don't always know what's going to pop out when they're born. Things like intelligence, what kind of genes do you screen for? It's not that easy. Genetics doesn't work like that because there's environmental influence as well.
But all the Indians do order doctors, I'm told. That's just standard, don't they?
The sperm donor, what do you say?
They all order doctors. So everybody wants doctor's sperm.
Yeah, and I think in America there's something where, I don't know, Nobel Prize winners.
Yeah.
And also Denmark is the biggest supplier of sperm in the world. And I heard that in Pakistan there's a big demand for it because, these are tall, blonde, blue-eyed people.
It's really quite disturbing when you put it like that.
It's disturbing, but that is how you can design a baby. I think anything more extreme and dystopian is scientifically
But the thing is, it doesn't take into account, okay, you order a designer child, but you've still got to bring the child up.
Exactly, that's the environment.
And that's where you make all your mistakes. Or you do well. I mean, we all have hopes for our kids. When you're carrying a child, you think, he is going to win the Nobel Prize. And then you end up with some mad kid who just likes jazz music and comedy. And you just go, I still love you. That's just the way you've come out. I may have eaten all the right food, but you're you. And that's the real part of being a parent.
I mean, my daughter's father is an identical triplet. And he and his brothers are very, very different and have achieved in very different ways. Same father, same mother, same upbringing. So identical genes.
There you go.
Yeah, I would kind of be very skeptical about that.
Thank you.
Who's got the mic? And then at the back there, please.
So I have a question. So is that they say that for a child, when there's a 9 months in mother's womb, all the emotional and everything comes from there. So how do you see the surrogate child is emotionally weak than the normal child?
That you know a lot about maternal.
I don't know about emotional. We know that things like diet, nutrition, stress is definitely has some sort of imprint on the baby, because that when you have stress, it creates the flow of certain hormones. It's a very physical, it's not mystical at all. There's something that's passed on because your blood supply is intimately connected. Also, obviously, in the worst case scenario, people who take narcotics and drugs, that all passes on to your child as well. Emotionally, I don't know. I mean, the hormones that are released in a woman's body when she's pregnant, there are a couple that cause this attachment. It's also what you produce when you have sex with someone. It's a bonding attachment chemical, and you have that with your children as well. The baby isn't necessarily is producing that itself. It's the mother's attachment to the baby, I would guess. There was a lady. Oh, okay.
Hi. You call it, you said it's an industry, and then you say, when do you ask a woman to stop, and who does she listen to? When does the surrogate stop, or how many does she stop at?
Well, again, this varies from clinic to clinic. The clinics that I researched said that made it a rule that the woman couldn't have more than 3 surrogate births, and that was it forever. That's not to say that they can go on to another clinic and pretend. I mean, there are certainly cases of husbands who are more or less pimping out their wives to carry children, because where else are they going to get that amount of money? This is the whole problem of it being deregulated. It's all under...
Yeah. Any system that's not regulated is going to be open to massive abuses.
Absolutely.
Whatever rules you put down.
Yeah.
Meera, thank you very much for writing this book and also for bringing up these issues. But don't you think that in the discussion there needs to be this whole recognition of the context? Because the issues that you've brought up are exactly the issues about women as reproductive commodities anyway, that their reproductive health in traditional societies belong to their in-laws, that women who get pregnant outside of marriage were encouraged to go through the whole pregnancy and then have the child taken away from them in exactly the same way. that often the wealth of the family depended on what the woman could produce reproductively, especially boys. So why are people making this a special case when it's just a more explicit expression of exactly what women have gone through in the last few generations?
I totally agree with you, and that's why when you read the book, you'll see that it crosses a number of threads. This is why, well, you heard that slight passage where Mala is looking at a prostitute and recognizing they're not doing anything much different, but also what happens to Tara in the book, and I don't want to give it away, is very much about the ownership of a woman's body. There's a reason this book was set in 2012, which was the year of the Delhi rape, which was a sort of sea change in attitude and almost our version of the Arab Spring, I think, but certainly had a massive impact on us in Britain. And we were standing on the streets with women here and men here, must be said. So there are, I hope I have put it in context, but you can only get that when you read the book. But absolutely, it's part of a much bigger issue about the ownership and possession and exploitation of women's bodies.
We have to end there, but thank you so much, Mira, for writing this incredible book. I think everyone
Thank
should
you.
go out and buy it, and Mira will
Thank
sign
you.
it.
We would like to thank the speakers. A little token from our side.
Is there a signing? No? Okay.
There would be a book signing. There would be a book signing. No author would be available there in the book signing area. This session was, we're thankful to Dainik Bhaskar. Session here at Mahindra Humanities Centre Durbar Hall, Forgotten Royal Treasures Uncovering the Jaipur Palace Collections.
Makes us ask the big questions. What's it all about? What's the purpose of life?
What does it mean to lose someone? What is loss about?
Nature of the human being, guilt and innocence? It's like the pulsating brain of the universe.
More than a place, it's a spirit of inquiry.
Major intellectual crossroads of the universe.
There's a sense of curiosity, excitement.
Issues that won't stay still in one discipline.
The Humanities Center is really the beating heart of this university.
राह गलिया डगर गांव नगर या शहर राह गलिया डगर गांव नगर या शहर आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया इधर उधर जहां भी जाएगी नजर कह रहा है ये सफर स्वच्छता का रंग भर आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया आसमां छूने चला है इंडिया फैसला ये कर चुका है इंडिया फैसला ये कर चुका है इंडिया बनेगा 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 स्वच्छ इंडिया 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 बनेगा बनेगा रे बनेगा बनेगा रे
Sure, thanks.
गुड़गांव से बेटी
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Mahindra Humanities Center, Durbar Hall. This session is called Forgotten Royal Treasures, Uncovering the Jaipur Palace Collections. We have Rima Ahuja, Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, Robert Elgood. We're still waiting for Naman. And Mrinalini Venkateswaran, moderated by Jill Tillotson. I'm sorry if I got that wrong.
We're just going to give it a minute so that people can take their seats, and in the hope that our last panelist will show up. Here he is. So, welcome everybody to this session on forgotten treasures. Forgotten, not lost, certainly. Remembered treasures, perhaps, would be a more apt title given the occasion. My name's Giles Tillotson. I am the consultant director at the City Palace Museum, the Maharaja Sawai Man Singh II Museum, which is the City Palace here in Jaipur, with responsibility for research and publications. I'm going to quickly introduce my fellow panelists before saying a word about what this panel is all about. I'm going to start with Dr. Naman Ahuja, who is a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University in the Arts and Aesthetics Department, and apart from his prodigious research, is probably best known to a wider audience as the curator of the magnificent Body in Indian Art exhibition at the National Museum a couple of years ago. Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones is one of the leading authorities on the city of Lucknow, which of course in the 18th century was the rival show to Jaipur in terms of the splendor of its architecture and the patronage of arts. She's written a large number of books on the architecture of Lucknow, but also on the coterie of aesthetes and administrators who formed the courtly culture, the culture around the court of Lucknow in the 18th and 19th centuries. Dr. Rima Ahuja is an archaeologist turned historian of Rajasthan par eminence, the author of an enormous, voluminous 1,200-page history of Rajasthan, which is a point of reference for all of us. But she writes very widely on topics of Rajasthani history, from architecture to manuscripts. Mrinalini Venkateswaran on my left is also a former archaeologist, in her case turned archivist. She is the projects head for Eka Archiving Services based in New Delhi, a company which the City Palace engages as consultants in the documentation of our collections. And Mrinalini has particularly been involved with a number of projects with us recently, including the development of the new painting and photography gallery in the City Palace. If you haven't seen that, leave at the end of this session and go straight to it. It's the most important new gallery in Jaipur in many, many years. Finally, Dr. Robert Elgood is the leading authority on Islamic arms, but whose expertise also extends to embrace India. He's done a lot of research in recent years on the Rajput armories in Jaipur and in Jodhpur. So that's the panel. The occasion is to mark the launch, the publication of a series of 4 major books, which the City Palace has published in collaboration with Niyogi Books of New Delhi, on aspects of the collection. I'm just going to run through them quickly so you know what they are and, as it were, how the panel fits in. So we have a study of arms and armour at the Jaipur court, which is a selection of just under 200 major works of the arms collection of the City Palace, written by Dr. Robert Elgood, and I'm going to ask him to speak to that. What you're seeing on the screen, by the way, is a selection of images from the books, and they're just kind of background wall decoration. I mean, I'm not going to ask the speakers to address the slides. It's just to give you some sense of the contents of the book. The second is Textiles and Garments at the Jaipur court, written by the very eminent authority on Indian textiles, Rahul Jain, who sadly can't be with us today. But again, he's taken the same approach. He's chosen over 100 major items from the collection and written notes and a long introduction on them. But he's also, interestingly in Rahul's case, discovered that a lot of textiles that were part of the Royal Toshakhana in the late 19th up until the early 20th century are now dispersed in museums around the world, that a number of items came out of the Toshakhana probably in about 1910, 1920. And a lot of these items are now proud possessions of museums across the world. Their Jaipur provenance is unknown until now. And this book actually includes a number of things which are not in our museum. They're in other museums in an attempt to reconstruct the Jaipur Toshakhana, or Kapadwara, if you like, as it once was. So that's the kind of landmark in collaborative scholarship, if you like, a single author, but working with lots of different museum collections to try and reconstruct a historical entity. The third book is Painting and Photography at the Jaipur court, which is really a multi-authored thing. It has been edited by Mrinalini Venkateshwaran and myself. This is, if you like, the book of the gallery, and we've depended on this, indeed in all of the books, but most especially in this book, on the help of our curatorial team at the City Palace, particularly Pankaj Sharma, the senior curator, Shafalika Awasti, the curator, and all of our colleagues, indeed, our conservators as well, have contributed to the making of this book. I'm going to ask Mrinalini to say more about this later, so I shall pass on. And the fourth is a rather different approach. It's called Festivals at the Jaipur court. All of the other books, you will see, in one sense, take perhaps, although I think they're in different ways landmarks in scholarship, and they take the subject forward. In each case, we've identified a bit of the collection and said, get someone to write about that. What Vibhuti Sachdev did is she said what she's interested in is festivals, and took a range of objects, paintings, garments, ritual objects, that one way or another relate to the celebration of Hindu religious festivals in the calendar year as it is celebrated in the City Palace. So it was a different way of looking at a collection, a different way of looking at objects. And that is the fourth book in the series. They are all now available. They're not all published on the same date. This one has been around a little bit longer, but they are now all available. I also want to say that the series is not closed. We feel that with 4, as it were, available, this is a substantial landmark moment of publication, but we intend to go on in the same direction, publishing more of the collection. I hope that introduces the purpose of this. I think what I'd like to do now is first to ask Dr. Robert Elgood to tell us a little bit about the arms collection, focusing particularly on what were the surprises that he found, both in terms of the unique objects, the less unique objects, the things that had to be redated or understandings changed. Dr. Robert Elgood.
Thank you very much. Is this switched on? Yeah. Thank you very much. The collection is terribly important in Jaipur. It's a world-class collection. Can you hear me now? Thank you. The collection in Jaipur is world-class. It's enormously important, and I look forward to the day when it can all be put on display. And it has appeared in various bits of it have appeared in various exhibitions, most importantly in the Metropolitan Museum, but the big exhibition on India. But nobody had really looked at it in terms of deciding what was absolutely crucially important. And I had that task. I was actually working in Jodhpur and was invited to come over and take a look at it with a view to writing a book. I was asked to write 50,000 words, and it was so exciting that I wrote 100. I was very loud to do that, I'm happy to say. And the pieces were totally different to Jodhpur. That was the first thing I found. Each armory in Rajasthan is different. There's not a lot of overlap. There is some, obviously. The reason for this, I think, is partly because Jaipur has such a very close connection with the Mughal court. And so Jaipur had some of the best pieces that you can find anywhere. They've rather got lost. The Mughals rather lost their collections, and they've been preserved here. So that's the first thing I'd say about it. The second thing is that Jaipur became enormously important as a centre of production. And in the 19th century, for various reasons, the Maharajas were encouraged to build great armories. They already had great armories, but they were encouraged to develop them, to clean them, to add to them. There was great enthusiasm for this, and Jaipur became one of the leading places in India for actually making things, making weapons, and doing very beautiful Kafgari work. So in that regard, one of the great problems of dating these objects is to decide what is original decoration from the 16th, 17th, 18th, there's not much 16th century around, 17th, 18th, 19th century, what is original decoration, what objects have been redecorated in the 19th century to make them look much better when you hang them on the wall or display them, as the Maharajas were doing, and what was actually made for the market in the 19th century and early 20th century, or carries on through the 20th century, because a great deal was being made. There were huge markets developed for Indian weapons in Europe and America, and you had Indian dealers, sometimes in partnership with British merchants, a lot of people working out of Bombay, who were selling vast quantities of material, which was made here in Jaipur and in Punjab, and this was being shipped abroad. So at this time you can still buy an awful lot of very good arms and armour, Indian arms and armour in Europe, Britain in particular, because of our past association with India. So this collection here was of enormous importance, and for me, one of the great things about it was it opened up that particular topic, and I returned to that in my Jodhpur catalogue, which I hope will come out this year. I think those are the most important things to start with, and I'll perhaps hand you back to Giles.
Well, can I just take you up on the question of the continuing production of arms in Jaipur in the 19th century? Because, of course, as Robert's long historical introduction points out, the actual use of arms in warfare effectively comes to an end in the early decades of the 19th century. But arms remain a very important part of Rajput court ritual for considerably longer than that, indeed up to the present day. So quite apart from the production of works for the market, there's also the continuing production of works for the court, but also there are certain kinds of arms that were produced, as it were, for exhibition. The wonderful skill in Kofgari, the inlaying of silver and gold in steel, which had been a form of embellishment, traditional embellishment, continues to be done by Jaipur craftsmen to produce pieces just to demonstrate their skill, and they're kind of sent across the world to be displayed in exhibitions of the decorative arts. And I wondered if you could perhaps comment a bit on how that knowledge, that historical perspective, then changes how one might see or approach some of the objects, both in this collection and indeed in collections elsewhere.
Well, gosh, it's rather different. I hope you could hear the first part of what I had to say. The great problem from a point of view of dating arms and armour, which is really in its infancy, there hasn't been a lot of work on this in the same way that you have on, say, Indian painting. There was an important book in 1890, and then there were a series of a limited number of books that actually dealt with this subject. And we are still considering the fundamentals, and the fundamental question is, when you look at an object, what is the date of the object? Is it an original or is it a copy of that? For example, when the Marathas came north to fight the Afghans at the Third Battle of Panipat and were defeated, vast quantities of weapons were obviously left behind by the Marathas when they fled. And the Afghans could only carry a certain amount of it home. the result was that you had Deccan-type Qatars, for example, which were abandoned on the battlefield, and those Qatars were then not something that the Afghans would have used. It was an alien weapon to them. It's a purely Indian weapon, and so they would have been sold. And so suddenly you start finding Maratha designs being reproduced across North India. I'm thinking particularly of Lucknow, where you can see Lucknow enamel, so there's no question about where the object comes from, but the form is pure Deccan. So all the time you're looking at the decoration, trying to decide what is original, whether the object is original and whether the decoration is 17th century, 16th, 17th century, or whether it is added in the 19th century, because there was a huge commercial demand for this. Now, the key thing in this is to get photographs of everything so that at least people can see what is out there. And that's why Bikash Neogi's book is so important, because this is a really good attempt to publish a really important collection. I'm glad to say that other people in other states in Rajasthan are doing the same thing. Jodhpur is about to publish something, and then after that there are others that are interested in talking about it. And the more these things are available, so you can see pictures, so you can actually see what is recorded about them, it does two things. It ensures that the scholars can really get to see what is here. Because if you're sitting in the States, for example, I had a question from a friend in the States recently, and he was asking me about an enamel piece, and he said there isn't a photograph anywhere. It's not a weapon, actually, it was a staff. And I have to send him a photograph while I'm here. There's this perpetual problem about actually knowing what is available in different collections. So these books are terribly important for that reason.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm going to ask Mrinalini to take us through the painting and photography volume in particular, to perhaps indicate how she thinks this book moves us on in terms of the study of painting of the Jaipur school and our understanding of photography in Jaipur, which is, after all, not an unknown subject. Mrinalini.
Thank you. Giles did mention that the core of the book is the exhibition that is currently on display at the museum. That exhibition in itself, I think, is important, a landmark, or a step forward certainly, because it pulls together to present an overview of the visual culture, that is contained within the Jaipur collections, which hasn't been done for a very, very long time, certainly. As far as the book itself goes, so in addition to covering the exhibition and what you see, so that it's there as a point of reference, it includes two chapters, one on painting and one on photography. The chapter on painting is by Sonika Soni, and what she brings to this, which is new, is that she herself is a painter. She comes from a family of miniature painters and connected with Mewar. And so she has an understanding of things that you or I would not be able to see that easily. So she's able to spot patterns. It's like recognizing somebody's handwriting. If you've looked at it long enough, she's able to look at the collection and say, okay, so these are the paintings that seem to be done by this person. So then what does that tell us about the kind of painting that they were producing? Are they, making portraits at a particular point in time, or is this person focusing on portraits while the other people working in this period are doing something else? What does that tell us about the kind of patronage that was extended by the Jaipur court? So she's able to address or bring in all of these questions just by her ability to be able to spot these patterns, which I think is great. I mean, it's not something that we would have been able to do without the documentation exercise that the museum's been engaged in for several years, because it offered this kind of opportunity for reviewing the collection in its entirety. And the chapter on photography, which I've written, has come out of something similar, because we embarked on this enterprise to review what we have. And we were looking at various types of materials. So we were looking at the printed material in the collection, so what we all usually understand as a photograph, something that's on paper. But we were also looking at the negatives, and in the late 19th century, these were on glass, so glass plate negatives. We were also looking at these. And Jaipur, of course, is unusual in having had a Maharaja who was not just interested in photography as something that he perhaps wanted to buy or have on his walls, but also something that he practiced. He was a photographer himself. We have his equipment in the collection. We've shown some of that in the gallery as well, and indeed covered it in the book. So you're then, sorry, is this echoing? So you're then in a position to, sorry. So then you're in a position to, again, see the breadth of material available. And I think that's important because it's also about locating our understanding of Ram Singh as a photographer, and indeed the collection that he put together, but also his successors put together in a much wider context. What is going on in photography, early photography in India at this point? What's going on in other courts? For example, at Udaipur, another Maharana there was, passionate about photography, but he didn't photograph himself. But when he was passing through Jaipur, Savai Ram Singh photographed him. So there is a picture of Maharana Sajjan Singh in the collection by Savai Ram Singh, again on display, so you can go and see it. So it's also about understanding these sort of the wider historical context, indeed, of early photography in India as well. So I think that's why it's exciting, because it's allowed us to review things and do this with them.
Thank you. Your comments, Mrinalini, prompt me to make two acknowledgements, in a sense that I omitted from my introductory remarks. The first is that, as Mrinalini indicated, these books have come out of a great deal of research and of fresh documentation of the collections, and I have to acknowledge the wisdom and the support of the trustees of the museum, that they were willing to take this long road. I said, we can do a kind of flash-in-the-pan book on the paintings collection, but we don't really know anything about it. We have to start by properly documenting the collections of photographs and paintings. This will take us some years. We will then be in a position to mount an exhibition and then be in a position to prepare the book. And they were willing to go with us that long route. So I have to acknowledge the support of the trustees of the museum and their good sense in that, their sound judgment. But also, coming out of Mrinalini's comments, I should acknowledge, of course, we're not the first academics or scholars to look at these collections, and the City Palace did have a body of senior scholarly curators in the 70s and 80s. One might mention particularly Gopal Narayan Bohra, who was a great Sanskritist who wrote on the manuscripts collection, Dr. Chandramani Singh, who wrote catalogues on the textiles collection, and with Bohraji on maps and plans. And of course, Dr. Ashok Das and Yadavendra Sahai, who did the first publications on the Ram Singh archive. It's been a while since those publications appeared. Understanding of the particular subjects and their context, I think, have moved on very considerably. Indian publishing, particularly with companies like Niyogi Books, has moved on a paradigm shift since those days. So I think that in more ways than one, these books are kind of a new generation of publishing of the collection. But I'm now going to turn to our three other panelists who are not directly involved in the series of books at all, to give us, because we've been kind of blowing our trumpets for a while. Our three colleagues are all familiar with the museum and with the wider art historical world that it is a part of. And so I wanted to get a sense of their perspectives, particularly starting with Dr. Rima Ahuja.
Yes, you were looking at me and I was wondering if I was going first. Is this on? No.
That becomes a starting point. There were a couple of words you used there. One was documentation. And until we know what is there, ways of looking at it, new ways of looking at it won't happen. So that is, I think, a takeaway I've had from just listening at this point. It's something I've always believed in. That's a different thing. But we need cataloging, documentation, and then this research always continues. So you either prove or disprove yourselves or somebody else, and that becomes part of a longer chain. So I was thinking to myself, there are other palace museums that are doing publications of their work and good work, and there are a lot of other collections, they don't have to be palace museum collections, where the work is not so well known. But what is it about the contemporary publications that might set them apart? And just to use that keyword, technology,
One, of course, is we are able to reproduce work a lot more. So rather than some of the black and white images that you would have from 19th century publications, or a whole lot of text which doesn't necessarily give you the visual impact, we have this fantastic, you're sharing in it by seeing the loop there. But that isn't all. Without research, it's merely a picture book. And as a child, I still love hoarding. And it comes from being a lapsed archaeologist and perhaps a lapsed historian. But most catalogs that you got from museums would have pretty pictures. And they still have pretty pictures of anything, whether it's an archer's thumb ring or a headgear of some sort, or clothes or weapons. It's the stories that go with them that attract the audience. And it's finding those hidden stories that happen when you research them more and bring them to the light that adds to the body of research knowledge. So somewhere there's actually much more than just a researcher and object relationship here. It's the viewer. It's people who are coming in to see a museum. And again, I must have been a stupid child because it took me ages to realize that museums only display a small bit of their collection. So, to be wowed by what they had there and wonder why it was not all in the book. Well, it can't all be in the book, but with all the modern digital forms and research, maybe we can bring more and more of them out. So I'm going to stop there for the moment and come back at some point. But I heard you say this is perhaps part of what can be a series. So good luck on that one. Let's hope we have more of them.
Was there something you wanted to respond to Robert about?
I did. It was on Dr. Elgood's thing about how the weapons have been refurbished, if that's the word or maybe not. But that, again, Rajasthan history, you hear of the famous Sirohi swords, and then what happens to them? They're not needed, so they go the way of anything that is not needed, like horse tongas on the roads outside. But something that came to my mind when you were talking, and I've thought of it earlier, is I also try and look for provenance and a kind of almost pure thing of this belongs to this period. And yet, as we see in architecture all around us, and it bugs me as a scholar to not be able to put a date, but it's part of a living tradition. So to refurbish or redo or decorate a plain item would have been part perhaps of what people in the 19th century thought. You have a piece? This looks a little plain to me. We don't need it. Do something to it. A bit like people in the 60s were picking up Persian coins without knowing the script, having a couple of holes drilled in them and wearing them as jewelry. They were using it. And I'm just wondering whether we need, as scholars, as I said, it bugs me to see that kind of a thing, but whether we need to understand the perspective that would make someone want to redo items, even the paint over a painting or a photograph.
Thank you very much. Can I just complete the loop and then we'll come back? Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones, tell us your...
Thank you. I'd like to look at these publications from a slightly different point of view. Firstly, as an editor, and I'm actually quite surprised that Giles still has all his hair, because the job of an editor is to tear your hair out because everybody is so late with their contributions, and to coordinate photographs, research, captions, covers, text like this is a wonderful achievement, and I think everyone involved has to be congratulated. And also, as an academic, of course, these are extraordinarily valuable publications, and I will be, if not exactly taking them home in my luggage because they're rather heavy, having them posted to me in London. But I think what I'd like to look at very, very briefly is from the point of view of the tourist, the Indian tourist and the foreign tourists. And both Giles and I are actually tour leaders for an English company. We take groups of foreigners, normally about 8, 12, 20, around various sites, and the tours do have a theme. And my particular theme is Bengal. So obviously I take people to the Victoria Memorial Hall, and I have to say I feel almost Indian when I do, because I am extremely embarrassed by the lack of visual material of publications. For any of you who know the Victoria Memorial, all I can say is that there is a tiny shop under the main stairs. You have to look at it, and then you have to go in and see if there's someone there, and then you have to try and persuade him to show what he has for sale. And it's difficult, but I think this is probably a familiar scenario to many of you. A place like the Victoria Memorial is so rich in collections. It has one or two books which are normally out of print, and there are no plans to reprint. What I would like to see is, not just in Calcutta, but in provincial museums like Lucknow, publication on this scale. Now, it's not going to happen for financial reasons, for reasons of inertia, but not because of reasons of lack of research and good scholars in India who could produce these things. We need initiative to get this done. It is so important. And also, what I don't want to see is, we talked briefly about technology, I don't want to see websites as a substitute for the printed word. I really don't. There are one or two institutions who think if they put up a website, for example, the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which is another bugbear of mine, it's not a substitute for a catalogue. These are magnificent volumes, all praise to the contributors and the editor.
Thank you very much, Rosie. I won't deny the trials of being an editor, but I will say I've had some wonderfully cooperative authors, stimulating but also reasonably punctual. Finally, Naman.
Well, I'm both an art historian and now an editor of a publishing house that has, for the past 70 plus years, been bringing out books on Indian art and architecture, and has made its focus, it's Marg Publications in Bombay, and has made its focus bringing out illustrated books. And as an art historian, one's bugbear always was exactly what Rosie raised, that there is inadequate documentation of the great museums of India, what to say of the provincial museums of India. And because this documentation has not been done seriously, there are all kinds of abuses that happen. The abuses happen at different levels. The first is, of course, there is always the fear of pilfering. There's always the danger of the loss of the collection. When there is an attack on the collection, you don't really know what's been lost, because there was never adequately published, there weren't adequately published photographs in the public domain that would safeguard that collection. The second is that a lot of criticism has been levied against the museums of India for not having well-curated displays, for being boring displays. And so the quick fix that the government seems to think is to call in a bunch of designers and say, redesign our museums and redesign our collections, but the designers haven't got proper academic texts that tell them the narrative and the stories and the research behind each of the objects. And because that research isn't available, because those comprehensive and proper documentation and those catalogs aren't available, the designer ends up doing this quick fix. And it has the pretense of a certain amount of spit and polish, but it doesn't actually know the real story that lies behind the object. You can make a terrible mistake by putting a particular, something from the Arms and Armor collection into a 19th century gallery when it should actually be in the 16th, or a 16th century thing which has been redecorated in the 19th in the wrong room. If you don't know the right story behind the object, how it was used in the 16th and how it was reused, completely reinvented in the 19th, you wouldn't really know as a curator or as a designer as to where to position it and what to do with it. What do you want to communicate to the public? And that's why we need to reinvigorate our publications in India and get people to recognize the fact that there are dozens of museums that are absolutely crying out for lavishly illustrated proper catalogues to be brought out. And I'd like to exhort both the publishers who are here as well as the public to understand this lacuna, to understand this need, to be able to step in. These publications aren't easy to bring out. The reason why we as publishers balk at the prospect of such lavishly illustrated books is because they are so expensive. And if we were to market them at the kinds of prices that they actually add up to, they'd become quite unaffordable. And so the public, we do look towards sponsorship increasingly to be able to mitigate those costs and to be able to make this into a viable proposition. And I think if we don't all start actively working towards demanding as a public the kind of publications we deserve of our rich heritage, then we really have no one else to blame if it's lost, do we?
Naman, thank you very much indeed. I think that very much puts this series into a larger context. And we have very much, as I was saying earlier, this is a research-led series, which does not at all mean that it's dull. And indeed, the splendors of modern publishing help to present the thing stunningly visually. But the importance of the research, you say, is to provide the most up-to-date information, the most reliable information that we think we can at the moment. I'm going to invite some questions very shortly, but before I do that, I'm just going to give Robert and Mrinalini a second opportunity, a last opportunity to comment. You wanted to respond a little bit to Rima.
Thank you. Is this working? No. Thank you. Thank you very much. Rima said some interesting things about decorating objects. Apart from the fact that I would mention in passing that these objects are in fact documents, they will tell you a great deal. The point about the decoration is quite simple. For Shastriya, these are temples. The goddess is invoked to enter your sword, to make it successful in battle. You worship your weapons every year at Durga Puja, and therefore you make it as attractive as possible to the goddess to ensure that she likes taking up residence. And so the decoration for Shastriya is about making your sword attractive. You also add perfume, I might add. You perfumed weapons, quite normal. If you go into one of the perfume shops in Jodhpur, as I did, and said, I want some perfume for a sword, they said, certainly, sir, here it is. They had it on the shelf. It's that common. So the weapons are decorated for that reason, and of course they're then decorated by banyas in order to sell them. That is another reason. But even if you were a prince of Rajasthan and you acquired some Western weapon, the first thing you did was to take it to your workshop and get it covered in gold. And that was particularly the case in the 19th century. Earlier on, I would suggest that things were much more austere. And this is part of the reason why in the 19th century, when people who didn't know what they were talking about wanted to start collecting these things, obviously if you were a foreign tourist, you wanted something highly decorated. The Victorians covered everything in England with decoration, and when they came to India, they thought they should trump that with something more exotic. And so the custom developed of having rather odd conversation pieces rather than proper weapons. So I think that is a key understanding. These swords and things don't really go out of fashion if you do as I do and go around and see Shastriyas in weddings and places. As soon as they learned that I was writing upon this subject, I would be surrounded by a little knot of Rajputs pulling their swords out in the corner of the wedding. It got quite embarrassing, actually. And I saw some wonderful swords, but their swords were terribly important. And you will understand that the point about the Rajput Dharma system is that warriors believed that they had inherited certain traits from distinguished ancestors, going back, of course, to Rama and Ayodhya. And this tradition was terribly important to them, and therefore their weapons were absolutely crucial, to the extent that you could actually send your sword if you didn't want to go to a wedding for some reason, your own wedding, because you were otherwise engaged, there was a threat to your state and you couldn't go for some reason, you could send your sword, and your sword would represent you and the bride would marry the sword, and the last phara, the last circle, would be completed when the bride reached the groom. So the sword was that important. And when the sword traveled across India to the bride's home, it was given its own tent, it was entertained with dancing girls and music, it had a full escort, just as though the Maharaja himself was traveling. So these swords are terribly, terribly important. And I would say that the collections I've seen in Rajasthan have enabled me, having spent too many years probably, studying this subject, to actually take the subject forward, in my view, quite considerably, and changing understanding of what we're actually looking at, and an important part of that is the anthropology. So I would urge you not to just look at these as rather beastly things for killing people, which the Rajputs are rather good at, I have to say, which is what made them so successful in history. After all, they're rather small in number, but terribly important in history. These are culturally terribly important to the Rajputs, and that's why it's really important they are preserved in Rajasthan. The final thing I would say is that we've heard a great deal about the Mughals over the years, and the Great Mughals is a term that everybody knows. I would like to put the case for the Great Rajputs, because I think the Rajputs have been slightly overshadowed, partly for political reasons. Following the events of 1857-58, the British were very obsessed about the threat of a second rising, and therefore they studied Muslim India rather more closely, and the Rajputs have not had their proper say in historical terms, and I'm glad to say Rima's book has taken that forward. Anyway.
Thank you, Robert. Arms and armour obviously go together as one thing. Textiles and garments obviously also go together as one thing. Painting and photography, is there a bit of an elision there? Are they two very different kinds of picture making? Well, one of the things that we found when looking at the collections, Mrinalini and I, with our colleagues in the museum, with Pankaj and Shafalika, the curators, we decided to do, first of all, a gallery that combined painting and photography, and then the book, as I say, came out of that, was that we found that there was actually, by the time photography appears, obviously, not before, a rather special relationship between these two forms of picture making in the court in Jaipur. And I wanted to ask Mrinalini perhaps to address, as finally, a little bit about that, about the crossover images that are neither one nor the other.
I think the late 19th century is an interesting point at which to focus on, because that's when a lot of things are going on, and photography has come into the Indian subcontinent by this point. So it's something that people, especially in the courts, are familiar with. And painting traditions, of course, have been around for a long time. And, you know, we all learn it in school as well, of course. But, you know, it's been around for a long time. This is how we see our world, you know, whether it's the rock-cut caves in, the cave shelters in Bhimbetka, or, you know, miniature paintings. So it's interesting to see. It's also difficult to explain without being able to show you examples, but it's interesting to see how these two ways of picture making, if you will, of sort of visually representing the world, speak to each other. At this point, I do want to draw together a couple of the things that Robert and Naman have, and indeed all of us have been saying, which is that the research that we put into these kinds of efforts are so important, because they're the things that allow the stories to emerge. And it's only when you start seeing things across the country, in terms of collections opening up across the country, that it's hugely important, because it's only then that you really start understanding what's going on. You do need that larger context to be able to understand your local example. So for me personally, for example, I worked at the City Palace in Udaipur many years ago, worked on the photographic collection there, and indeed worked on a collection in some ways that was similar, but in other ways that was very different, which also included photographs that were painted. So that, my understanding of that collection was instrumental in informing my understanding of this collection, to see how artists and photographers interacted with each other. It wasn't some kind of Cold War that, you know, if I like painting, I will only, you know, continue to use painters. Painters themselves took to photography, and, you know, photographers employed artists to, you know, paint over pictures, because at the end of the day, that gave you the best deal. You had the advantage of a realistic picture, but one that was further enhanced, made more real by the application of color. So it's this interaction which is fascinating because it produces sometimes really weird stuff, sometimes really interesting pictures, which remind you of a very modern way of picture making with Photoshop. You can kind of Photoshop anything in, and you'd be surprised to see how much of Photoshopping was going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Thanks so much. So I want to open the floor now to questions, and please feel free to address the wider issues about museum publications that were raised by our other panelists, as well as the matters of this particular series of books. There's a gentleman in the front row. Can we get a mic to him, please?
Thank you for the interesting discussion. I did quite a bit of research in Hyderabad on the Nizam royal family. So there's two aspects to my question. One is, as you all know, a lot of the collections from Hyderabad were simply pilfered and stolen and taken away because the last Nizam of Hyderabad, of course, went off to Australia and became a sheep farmer, and all those treasures were just basically left to be stolen. But what was interesting when I was there was that some of the best stuff that had been left were the photographs, because the antique collectors and so on who came and took all this stuff or stole it or could pocket it didn't think that the photographs were all that valuable. So what we have left in Hyderabad is an extraordinary collection of photographs from the Nizam period, especially the Raja Deen Dayal studio and others who did that. But the other aspect of the question is, to what extent are the different royal families in India supportive of this sort of work that you're doing? Is the push coming from them, do they recognize their heritage? Do they see an importance in documenting it, in having it published, having it made better known to the outside world? Or do you sometimes, or is it coming from scholars like you who go to these families and say, you've got these extraordinary artifacts, you've got these extraordinary collections, we need to we need to document them, we need to preserve them?
Well, a bit of both, perhaps, but I can only, speaking from about Jaipur and Jodhpur, for example, where both Robert and I have worked, we were invited in, as it were. The trustees decided that they needed assistance and wanted things to move forward. So in those cases, the initiative has very much come from them. I wonder whether on the wider issue, I might bat that away. Naman, do you feel that you would able to comment on the wider issue of royal collections in general, rather than Jaipur in particular?
I mean, I don't think there's a straightforward answer to this. I think there are the drive. I think this is working now. Yeah. I think the drive to publish. There isn't a concerted one-way street. It's a bit hit or miss. It's what luck of the draw. Sometimes it's a scholar who is particularly passionate and wants to get something done. At times it's because there is a patron or an owner of a collection who wishes to sponsor it and could be convinced to sponsor something. Rarely the initiative comes from a publisher. But I think editors need to cultivate markets better, because that responsibility ultimately of disseminating a collection then falls equally upon the museum and the book publisher. To get the right tone of writing and get the research done is one job, but then to actually make sure that there is a venue which will see to the wider dissemination of a collection. And royal collections have a particular appeal because of, in the tourist market, but also in the general population. And that brings with it a slightly other responsibility as to whether the royal collection is going to be something that is apprehended only by a well-heeled English-speaking elite, or is the royal collection actually going to be able to reach out to the larger public that comes to see that collection? And that's very tricky for us in India at the moment, because it's not easy to publish art history in the vernacular. That's a very tough thing. We only end up publishing art history in India in English. And the Jaipur Lit Fest is an exceptional space where we do talk about publishing in Hindi as much as we do about, to a lesser extent than we do about publishing in English. But I think this is something that we need to really take on board.
I think it's a point well taken. Can I just say that although these books are, of course, all in English, our museum policy, our galleries are all bilingual, and Hindi actually comes first in all of our captions and text panels. There's a lady in the second row.
Yeah, I think we should thank City Palace for taking out these 4 volumes in order to interpret City Palace so well. But I've always wondered that does your research at some point also look into the context of making a painting, or it was just the painting, in order to understand the wider setting or the wider context in that era?
Oh, yes, I think do you want to answer that in relation to the painting book? I mean, I think that actually these books, because they have long historical introductions, actually they feed into a lot of different histories, if you like. I mean, I know Robert's book, for example, his essay looks at the place, as he's been hinting, at the place of arms in Rajput society. It's not just here's a museum object that I can tell you about and measure and photograph. It's about the meaning and use of that piece in time. And certainly with the painting and photography book, yes, both of the essays are concerned to locate the movement, the shape of the development of Jaipur painting and then photography in terms of what's going on historically and politically around the court. There are other histories that they tap into as well, including the history of museums, indeed, particularly in the case of Rahul's book, which is partly about the ways in which objects get dispersed and recollected and relabeled and re-understood.
If I can just add to what Giles said, certainly, I mean, the methods of production and the context of production, also understanding what sort of a workshop was, is this, okay, so for example, we have a series of 101 paintings, each of them with a different artist's name, but it's well sort of known or understood about miniature paintings. They were frequently painted by more than one person. You had a master artist and you had, other people doing other things. So just the part of the point of the research that Sonika has done is also to help us see that, to see, how are these paintings made in Jaipur as well. It also connects to the larger themes of patronage and collecting, because, and that's something that is mirrored in the exhibition that the book accompanies, because what we're trying to understand is what were the rulers of Jaipur buying or collecting or acquiring from outside Jaipur, but equally what were they commissioning within Jaipur, and how do these things interact with each other? Because obviously as an artist, if you're working in the atelier, you're also seeing the stuff that the Maharaja is buying or acquiring or being gifted or whatever. So how are you responding to this, and how does that reflect in your work? So these are also questions that both the gallery and the publication try to address. And I also want to say that the point of research and writing and publications and museums and all of the things that we do is not necessarily to find the right answer to a particular question. It's really about opening up dialogue, conversation, getting all of us to look at, we walk into a room, we see, these pictures, even at Diggy. It's to get us to look again and try and understand, is there more than what I'm just seeing in the first instance?
I think we can perhaps squeeze in one or two more.
This is more of an observation rather than a query to Dr. Elwood. This relationship between aesthetics and armory, did you at any point feel that there is some connection, or are they inversely proportionate? For instance, the more ornamental a sword or a dagger, the deadlier its damage, for instance. So it's more on a philosophical level than anything
I don't think there's any connection at all. I would say that the early pieces tend to be rather austere. I think that the Rajputs were quite austere, and that they became much more ornate. The arms, and you can tie decoration of arms and armour to developments in painting, for example. Use of gold on paintings increases massively at the end of the 18th century, and you'll find that the same thing occurs on the weapons. There is a change, but the Jodhpur in particular has a wonderful collection of early swords which have survived in a unique, they're not available anywhere else that I know, and these are very, very austere things. And the use of gold in Rajasthan, as in elsewhere in other worlds, I mean, I think of the Balkans, where I've also worked, it comes comparatively late. Gold is used very sparingly, except for the most highest levels of society. In my view, it's used rather sparingly until late. Does that answer your question?
Can I just, did Rima have a word?
Well, it's been triggered off by a word you used. And what museum collections have helps us know a lot more. But what we have lost as society, as what has been lost to us, the swords of ordinary people must have been melted down and used over and over and over, new ones made. So what we don't have tells as much of a story, and therefore the value of all of this becomes more, that you highlight what is available, but it gives you question marks for what could be and has been.
I think we can just squeeze one last question in from this gentleman in the second row.
Hello. I just wonder, the paintings and the armor or any Indian art, they were like an exchange of goods between the two estates, the paintings or armor coming from the Mughal court to Jaipur court. But actually they were made in the Delhi or Imperial Mughal shop. But when they are found in the Jaipur court, they are actually ascribed to the Jaipur court. They were made from the Jaipur Imperial Mughal court. So is there any way to differentiate between providing the exact provenance for the goods, for the paintings, apart from the schools, that they can be retained to their original provenance?
It's an excellent question. I'm going to pass it to Mrinalini.
I'm going to pass it on to Robert in a minute. I'm not an arms expert, I'm not a painting expert either, but I do work a lot with very different kinds of collections, and a lot of my work is about documentation and managing collections, so to help museums and institutions kind of figure out what they have, how to sort out their systems, etc., etc. So from my point of view, which is a slightly, sort of one step back, as someone who works with the material without necessarily being an expert, I would always seek to record all of those things that you've just said, because I think all of those things are important and relevant to an object's history. And part of my job as a documentation person is to record all of that, because Robert may come along and pick out, use 3 of those details in a particular way. Naman may use 2 others in a particular way. Somebody else may use all of them. The point is that the information should be available. All of it is equally important, and all of it is relevant to that object's history. That's the way I would look at it. Over to Robert.
Well, I would say that the objects are pan-Indian insofar as the Maharajas were going to Delhi to buy things. They were also had their own workshops here in their state capitals. They spent a great deal of time under the high days of the Mughals being sent off as governors, so they might be working in Afghanistan, and they would use local craftsmen. The Rajputs deliberately sent the Maharajas to administer different parts of the country so that they were in a bad position if they wanted to rebel. So there was a policy there to keep them away, and of course they had their workshops that came with them. So what you're looking at is something that is pan-Indian, but there are regional characteristics and regional symbols. And there are certain places. Sirohi is the obvious one in Rajasthan for making saw blades. Now, Sirohi saw blades are magnificent, but as far as I know, they were never used by the Mughals. And there's an interesting moment when you can start seeing the Sirohi trying to copy watered steel blades in the Mughal style. And they do it rather badly, actually. They're not sure how to do it. They get the right metal, and they join them, and you can see the lines on the blade where they have tried to weld cakes of metal together. So you can read these objects, and part of my game is to try and read them and understand them, and I'm continually finding new things, and that's why Rajasthan has been so important for me.
When you visit the new gallery in the City Palace, as I hope you will, you'll find that the structure of the painting and photography new gallery is precisely this duality that we have between made in and bought for. We looked through the collections and things were either commissioned by Maharajas from their own court artists, but many, many of them were diplomatic gifts or other kinds of acquisition. And then these two things start interacting because a diplomatic gift comes into the Surat Khana. It's held not, as it were, just in the personal possession of the king, but is made available to his artists so that the Jaipur artists are able to assimilate styles of painting in just the same way that Robert's been talking about in the arms. So that duality that you talk about absolutely is an important way of understanding the arts of the period. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their support and their comments, and to all of you for attending. There are flyers available. I will take a bundle of books and go and sit in the author's signing tent if anyone of you would like to see the books. They are, I think, also available in the Amazon store, at least some of them. One of them is absolutely brand new, just off the press this week, so it may not yet have reached Amazon. But we have flyers of all of them, and you're welcome to come and have a glance at them in the signing lounge. Thank you very much. I think it's time for lunch.
Thanks a lot, speakers. And a little token from our side. Thank you all for attending this session. To know the next sessions at JLF, you can give a missed call on 9251-301-339 and receive them on your phone. Win a chance to win JLF goodies. Tweet using the hashtag ZJLF. The more you tweet, the more points you would get. Exciting prizes are up for grabs. For more details, visit the information desk. And authors will be proceeding towards the book signing area.